Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. It started on a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood park. It wasn't a grand park by any means, just a quiet, well-worn path surrounded by tall, rustling trees. I'd always found peace there, away from the noise of the city. But that day felt different. The air was cool, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I walked deeper into the woods, far from the usual crowded picnic areas. The silence was comforting, or so I thought. The chirping of birds had faded, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the faint rustling of branches above. I noticed something unusual: footprints. They were fresh, clearly defined, leading deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it might have been someone else enjoying the peaceful afternoon, but there was something strange about them. They were small, as if made by a child, but too perfectly spaced, as if they had no owner. I shrugged it off. Maybe some wildlife had wandered through, or perhaps another hiker was more adventurous than I was. I pressed on, my curiosity growing. The path narrowed, and soon I found myself surrounded by tall trees that loomed overhead. The light faded quickly, casting eerie shadows around me. I began to feel uneasy. Every creak of the branches overhead seemed louder, and my footsteps felt heavier, like they were echoing in an empty void. Then I heard a faint whisper. It came from somewhere ahead, drifting through the trees like a cold breeze. The words were indistinct, but I could feel their presence more than I could hear them. My pulse quickened as I slowed my pace, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though still incomprehensible. I stopped, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispering wasn't just words, it was something else entirely. It sounded almost like laughter, but not human. The sound seemed to echo through the trees, coming from all around me, bouncing off the bark and rustling leaves. Panic began to creep in. I wanted to turn back, but something compelled me forward. The whispers had turned into faint, chilling laughter, distant but unmistakable. I tried to reassure myself, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound didn't fade. It was deliberate, as if whatever was making that noise was toying with me. I kept walking, faster now, heart pounding harder. The trees became thicker, the light dimmer, my breath fogged in the cool air. I felt as though I were being watched from all sides. The laughter continued, distant, but growing closer. My vision blurred as I stumbled over a root, falling to my knees. I didn't want to turn around, but I could feel something behind me, something watching. I forced myself to stand, gripping a tree for balance. I didn't want to look back. I couldn't, but the laughter was no longer distant, it was right behind me, echoing from the shadows. I could feel its presence, right at the edge of my vision, as though it were breathing down my neck. Go. The whisper hissed in my ear, though there was no one there. I could feel its breath, cold and damp, against my skin. The voice wasn't human, it was hollow, ancient, and wrong. I stumbled forward, unable to run, unable to escape the feeling that something was right behind me, watching, waiting. I could hear the laughter, growing louder, more insistent. I began to sprint, my feet slipping on the damp earth. The woods stretched endlessly, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from whatever had followed me. I burst out of the trees and back into the clearing, gasping for breath. I turned, heart still racing, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, the trees, and the fading sound of that laughter. Carried away by the wind, that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been with me in those woods. The laughter still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't sleep. My mind haunted by the memory of that voice, that presence, That wasn't truly their dot to this day. I avoid that park. Something in those woods followed me, and I know I'll never forget it. It was a late summer evening when we decided to take the old railway tracks that ran parallel to the edge of town. They were no longer in use, left to rust under the weight of time. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the tracks as we walked. The air was warm, tinged with the faint scent of wildflowers and dried grass. There were 5 of us, me, my 2 friends, and a couple from the neighboring town we had just met. We'd agreed to take the tracks all the way to the old bridge that had been abandoned for decades. The bridge was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its history. He was too far away, but I could see his posture, his head tilted oddly. "Alex!" I screamed, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. The figure was closer now, much too close. Alex took another step, and then he vanished, just like that. One moment he was there, and then the air shifted, and he was gone. I could barely breathe. The others were running towards me, shouting my name, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. My mind was still locked on the spot where Alex had been. "Alex!" I screamed again, my throat raw, but there was no response, nothing. The figure, whatever it was gone, and so was Alex. The others were examining it, laughing at the words we couldn't quite make out, but I noticed something else. The tracks ahead looked wrong, too quiet, too still. It was the silence that struck me most. No birds, no distant sounds of life, just that oppressive stillness. As we approached the old bridge, we could see it stretched out ahead, suspended over the river. The wooden planks were rotting, creaking in the breeze. It had the kind of haunted feel that only time and neglect could bring. There were stories, whispers, of people vanishing near the bridge, of strange shapes moving in the shadows beneath. Standing at the edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something about the air felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on us. My friends were still joking, but I felt that same distant sensation, the one that prickled my skin like I wasn't supposed to be there. We hesitated for a while, unsure whether to cross. My friend, Alex, laughed and started walking onto the bridge, saying he wanted to check it out. We didn't stop him, curiosity was too strong. But something about his figure standing there, silhouetted against the twilight, made my stomach turn. I stayed behind, watching from the shore, my eyes locked on him. The others were still further down the tracks, chatting and laughing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I saw it, movement, just beyond the bridge. A figure. At first, I thought it was Alex, maybe playing some kind of prank. But as I squinted, the figure didn't seem right. It wasn't human. It wasn't a person. The shape was too tall, too thin. Its head didn't move like a normal person's, jerking unnaturally as if it didn't belong in this world. I called out to Alex, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. The figure remained, watching him. I yelled again, louder, but there was no response. I looked back at the others, who had finally started to notice my panic. One of them, Emma, looked at me with a frown. "Is everything okay?" she asked, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It took a step forward, just one slow, deliberate step, and I watched in horror as Alex turned to face it, his back to me. He was too far away, but I could see his posture, his head tilted oddly. "Alex!" I screamed, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. The figure was closer now, much too close. Alex took another step, and then he vanished, just like that. One moment he was there, and then the air shifted, and he was gone. I could barely breathe. The others were running towards me, shouting my name, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. My mind was still locked on the spot where Alex had been. "Alex!" I screamed again, my throat raw, but there was no response, nothing. The figure, whatever it was gone, and so was Alex. It started on a calm, late summer evening. I had been driving home from a long day at the beach, tired and ready to settle in for the night. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the winding country road. It was one of those nights where the only sounds were the faint hum of the engine and the soft creak of the tires on the pavement. About halfway home, I saw something strange. A figure, standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a hitchhiker, but the figure wasn't moving. It was completely still, just standing there, perfectly straight, its head tilted as if it were watching me. I slowed down, glancing at it as I passed. The street lights were sparse, and the area was desolate. I expected to see some sign of life, maybe a house or another car passing, but there was nothing. Just the figure. My stomach twisted as I stared in the rearview mirror. It was still there, unmoving, watching. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe some debris or a tree branch shaped like a person. But as I drove further, the unease wouldn't leave me. The figure was still in my line of sight, like a dark presence lurking at the edge of my vision. I finally pulled over, my hands trembling. There was no reason to stop. No one to explain it to? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to look back. I stepped out of the car and turned, staring down the empty road. The figure was still there. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood, watching. I froze, the quiet night pressing down on me. My heart pounded as I realized something was wrong. I started walking back toward it, my legs heavy with dread. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It wasn't like any person I'd ever seen. The shape was off, too tall, too thin, its head angled unnaturally to the side. I stopped, too scared to take another step. The silence stretched until I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. The figure tilted its head further, as if studying me, and then it moved, but not like a person. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was mimicking something it didn't understand. In that moment, I turned and ran back to my car, the figure's silhouette disappearing behind me. I didn't look back as I drove off, leaving it behind in the darkness. I've never gone back to that road since, and I never will. Some things are better left unseen. I'll never forget the day my family decided to take a trip to that old, abandoned amusement park. It was a place I had heard of, but never thought we'd visit. Set deep in the woods, far off any well-traveled roads, it was a relic from a bygone era, crumbling and overgrown with weeds. Most people said it was dangerous, but my parents thought it would be an adventure for us kids, something different from the usual summer trips. From the moment we parked the car, I felt a strange chill in the air. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to muted grays, and the silence that filled the place felt oppressive. The park looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it didn't sit right with me. My sister, laughing, tugged at my arm and insisted we explore. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting. At last, I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I heard them, she whispered, the voices. They're everywhere. We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, we were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. My sister ran ahead, laughing and calling to me, until I couldn't hear her anymore. That's when the whispers started. I was sure I was imagining them at first. Soft, almost inaudible voices carried through the empty air, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing to see. just the towering remnants of the old rides, the stillness, and that chilling silence. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. "Sarah, where are you?" A knot formed in my stomach. I told myself she must have wandered ahead, but the fear wasn't about her. It was the way the park seemed to pulse around me, the silence now heavier than before. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a faint voice, soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Turn back." I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing but the empty Ferris wheel, its great skeletal arms stretching into the gray sky. I stood there, waiting, but there was nothing, only the wind stirring the dust around my feet. "Hello," I asked, but my voice sounded thin and distant, swallowed by the emptiness. Suddenly, the sound of laughter filled the air, high-pitched, childlike, but hollow. It echoed through the park, bouncing off the old rides, each bounce seeming to come from different directions at once. I ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, calling out for my sister. The laughter followed, growing louder, closer. I stumbled over twisted metal, fallen beams, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had returned, louder this time. "Come closer." I wanted to scream, to run, but the park had become a maze of rusted remnants. The ground was uneven with debris. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting. At last, I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she whispered, "the voices. They're everywhere." We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, we were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. No matter how fast we ran, it felt like we were moving in circles. The whispering followed, growing louder, until it was in our ears, demanding something we couldn't comprehend. I didn't look back, couldn't, but I heard it, the sound of something following us, not just from the woods, but from within. We made it to the car, screaming, throwing ourselves inside. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from the park, leaving the ruins behind. The silence of the woods stretched out once again, but this time, it felt different. We haven't been able to forget that place. The memory of the whispers, of Alice, whoever she was, and the shadow that followed us, haunts us. It was supposed to be a simple adventure, but it turned into something far beyond what we were prepared to face. The entrance gate stood rusted and sagging, surrounded by overgrown grass and wild vines. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the silence was oppressive. We ignored the chills creeping up our spines and pressed on. The park itself was eerily quiet. The old roller coaster loomed ahead, its skeletal frame covered in ivy. Rides like the Ferris wheel, carousel, and bumper cars had all fallen into disrepair. Faded paint peeled off in strips, revealing splinters and decay beneath. It was like walking through a forgotten nightmare. We split up, wandering through the crumbling structures. I made my way to the top of the Ferris wheel, the rusted steps creaking under my weight. From up there, I could see for miles just trees, stretching out in every direction. The whole park seemed swallowed by nature, left behind as if the world had forgotten it existed. As I looked down, I felt something strange, a shift in the atmosphere. The wind had died down completely, leaving the air thick and still. The silence felt unnatural. It wasn't the silence of a peaceful day, but something heavier, as though something was watching, waiting. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the unease grew stronger. When I climbed back down and rejoined my friends, they seemed just as uneasy. We avoided mentioning it, not wanting to scare each other further. We decided to check out the old carousel. Its horses stood frozen mid-motion, some toppled and broken. The music box that had once played sweet melodies had rested shut. But the strangest part, a faint melody seemed to drift through the air, as if someone had wound the box and set it to play, though no one was there to do it. Must be the wind, one of my friends said, but even they didn't sound convinced. That's when we heard it, a faint whispering, too low to make out words. It came from behind us, from somewhere deeper in the park. We spun around, but there was nothing. What the hell was that? Someone whispered. We all exchanged uneasy glances, our skin crawling. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no sound of wildlife. Just that eerie whispering, growing louder, closer. I had the distinct feeling that whatever it wasn't natural. As we moved cautiously through the park, we stumbled upon the old ticket booth. Inside, the torn remnants of paper tickets floated in the air, as if something had been sifting through them. On the counter, a faded name tag still hung. Alice. None of us knew anyone named Alice, but the name felt oddly familiar, as if it had been whispered through the ages. Suddenly, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, a shadow, standing at the edge of the ticket booth, barely visible against the dim light. It was small, like a child, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. Guys, I choked out, my voice trembling. They turned to follow my gaze, but the figure was gone. That's when we heard the sound again, soft, almost inaudible, but this time unmistakable. The whispering was coming from every direction, as though it was all around us, folding in from the trees. Let's go, one of my friends said, panic in their voice. We bolted back toward the entrance, but the park seemed to stretch on endlessly. No matter how fast we ran, it felt like we were moving in circles. The whispering followed, growing louder, until it was in our ears, demanding something we couldn't comprehend. I didn't look back, couldn't, but I heard it, the sound of something following us, not just from the woods, but from within. We made it to the car, screaming, throwing ourselves inside. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from the park, leaving the ruins behind. The silence of the woods stretched out once again, but this time, it felt different. We haven't been able to forget that place. The memory of the whispers, of Alice, whoever she was, and the shadow that followed us, haunts us. It was supposed to be a simple adventure, but it turned into something far beyond what we were prepared to face. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. One path stretched ahead, wide and inviting. The other disappeared into the trees, barely a trail. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the less traveled path, the one that felt like it might lead to something hidden, something forgotten. The further I drove, the deeper the trees became, until the road was almost completely blocked by thick branches. My car slowed to a crawl, crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. It was getting darker now, the sun almost gone, leaving behind only the faint light of dusk. I kept going until I reached what appeared to be an old barn, rotting wood and a sagging roof. It stood isolated in a clearing, its once bright red paint now faded to a dull gray. Curiosity got the better of me, and I parked beside it. I stepped out, the quiet almost deafening. I walked towards the barn, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The door was hanging open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Dust floated in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the roof. It felt as though no one had stepped inside for years. I explored the barn, half expecting to find some long-lost treasure or a relic from a bygone era. Instead, I found remnants of a past that didn't seem so distant. Rusted tools, empty cages, and old hay scattered across the floor. There was something wrong about the stillness. Then, from the far corner of the barn, I heard a soft, rasping sound. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was faint, but distinct, like something was breathing. Slowly, I turned toward the noise, expecting to find nothing but shadows. But there, crouched in the farthest corner, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape blending with the shadows. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, its limbs too long and ungainly, moving in jerky, unnatural ways. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't look away. The creature, or whatever it was, stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Then, it moved. Slowly, as if unsure of itself, it began to rise, its movements erratic, like a marionette with broken strings. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath ragged, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind me died as I ran back to my car. I didn't dare look behind me. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. The evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in a wash of orange and pink as I stood in the middle of the field, staring out at the sprawling farm. The summer harvest was winding down, and I was finishing up my last task, picking a few late-season tomatoes. The air was warm but carried a faint, bitter tang that didn't sit right in my throat. I glanced around, trying to push the feeling aside. There was no reason for it. The farm was my sanctuary, a place where nothing could go wrong. I'd been working on my uncle's farm for years. It was familiar, predictable, and usually quiet except for the crows that would squawk and wheel in the sky. But tonight, something was different. The field behind the barn was where I always finished my day. I loved the rhythmic rustle of the tall corn stalks and the occasional cricket chirping, a sound that calmed me down after a long day. But today, the corn didn't move with the wind. It stood still, like it was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something, fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle," I called, my voice shaking. He was already running towards me, but he stopped when he saw the arm. His expression shifted from concern to confusion, and then to something else I couldn't name. His eyes widened, and he glanced toward the woods before meeting my gaze. "You need to get inside now," he said, his voice low and rough. Before I could ask why, the arm pulled back into the cornfield, and a wet, spluttering sound followed. It was as though something was dragging itself, the thud of its movements muffled by the earth. The corn rustled violently, then fell silent again, a suffocating hush settling over everything. My uncle grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the porch. "Inside," he said, more urgently this time, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. A scream tore through the air, sharp and strangled. It wasn't human. It was like an animal, but worse, deeper, guttural. My body froze, but my mind raced, fighting the instinct to run. I glanced back toward the field, my uncle's grip digging into my arm. There, standing at the edge of the corn, was a figure. It was pale, emaciated, its limbs too long and crooked. It didn't have a face, just a void where I should be, a black, empty space that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Then it moved, not toward us, but sideways, disappearing into the woods, the corn behind it shivering as it passed. I staggered back as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something. Fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. Uncle. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I wanted to escape the city for a while. So, we decided to visit the old, abandoned amusement park just outside town. It had been closed for years, and rumors said it was haunted, but we didn't care. We were young, reckless, and looking for adventure. The park was a shell of its former self, with rusted rides and peeling paint. The Ferris wheel loomed over the grounds, its empty gondolas swaying slightly in the breeze. The air was heavy with the scent of old metal and something sour, almost like mildew. As we walked through the cracked entrance, a shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. We wandered from ride to ride, taking pictures and daring each other to step inside the old funhouse. Its glass was shattered, and the floor creaked beneath our weight as we stepped inside. The lights were long dead, but we each carried a flashlight, beams dancing across warped mirrors that distorted our reflections. "Did you hear that?" my friend, Marcus, whispered, and I strained my ears. It was faint but unmistakable laughter, high-pitched and childlike, like the giggle of a young girl. "Must be the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the laughter came again, clearer this time, coming from deeper inside the funhouse. I glanced at my friends. Sarah's face was pale, and Ben looked like he wanted to turn around and leave. "Let's just go," Ben muttered, eyes wide. But before anyone could move, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the halls of the funhouse, followed by a soft thumping sound, like small feet running across wood. Marcus took a shaky breath and pushed forward. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice faltered. We ventured further into the maze of warped mirrors and dark corners. I felt the back of my neck prickle as we reached the center of the funhouse. That's when I saw it, a small figure, standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged, flickering light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I saw. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9, with tangled hair and a dress that looked decades old. Her back was turned to us, but as we watched, she tilted her head to one side, as if she knew we were there. "Hey," Sarah called, voice quivering. "Are you okay?" The girl slowly turned, and my blood froze. Her eyes were black, empty pits that seemed to draw in all light, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. The air around us grew cold, and the flashlight went out. Marcus let out a strangled scream, and we all stumbled back, tripping over each other in a scramble to get out. The girl's laughter followed us, echoing and multiplying as if there were more of her. A chorus of voices overlapping and splitting in every direction. We ran, hearts pounding, pushing open the heavy doors of the funhouse. The laughter still rang in our ears as we sprinted across the park, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping for breath, tears streaming down our faces. When we looked back at the dark, silent amusement park, we saw the Ferris wheel. One of the gondolas was moving, slowly swinging back and forth, and then, from the top, a small face peeked out, eyes wide and empty, grinning down at us. We never went back. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a child's laughter, just beyond my window. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were us stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were us stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. My friends froze, eyes wide and breaths caught in their throats. We exchanged nervous glances, and then the giggle came again, this time closer. The floorboards creaked behind us, and we spun around to see a shadow at the end of the hall. It moved, quick and fluid, vanishing into a dark doorway. Without thinking, I started after it. The others shouted for me to stop, but I didn't listen. My feet carried me down the hallway, past faded portraits with eyes that seemed to follow me, until I reached the doorway. The room was dark, but a small, flickering candle on the floor cast a dancing light across the walls. It was surrounded by torn papers and strange markings, like some kind of ritualistic symbols. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something in the corner. It was a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained with what looked like dirt or something worse. The giggle returned, this time louder, and I spun around, heart racing. A woman stood in the doorway, her face obscured by a black veil. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating, and my flashlight flickered. The woman reached out, her fingers thin and gnarled, with nails as sharp as broken glass. I stumbled backward, but the floor caught my foot, and I fell hard against the wall. The others burst into the room, their eyes wide with terror. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at us with eyes that seemed to bleed from behind the veil. Then, suddenly, the candle blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard shuffling, quick footsteps, and then a loud thud. My flashlight flickered back on, revealing the others scrambling to their feet, panting and terrified, but the woman was gone. We ran out of the house, the front door slamming shut behind us as if held by an unseen hand. We stood there, breathless and shaking, staring at the old, creaking house. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. As we looked around, I noticed something horrifying. The window of the ballroom was wide open, and staring back at us was the child's doll, its cracked porcelain face split into an unsettling smile. We never went back. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the wind howls just right, I swear I hear that giggle. soft and echoing, from somewhere in the dark. I had never been a fan of driving long distances alone, but it was a rare chance to clear my head. My cousin's wedding was the next day, and I was determined to make it there. The route was scenic, winding through rolling hills and small towns that seemed frozen in time. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods with barely a sign of civilization. I pulled over when my phone buzzed, alerting me to a missed call. It was my cousin, reminding me of the directions and warning me that there would be no cell service in some areas. I laughed, thinking about how outdated that sounded, and tucked my phone away. That was the last sound I heard for a while. The road ahead curved into a darker part of the forest, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. As I drove, the headlights of my car bounced off the trunks, casting long, twisted shadows. I thought I saw movement up ahead, something darting just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just a rabbit or a deer. But then I saw it again, a tall figure that looked like it had been molded from bark and leaves, standing just out of reach of the light. It moved, jerking with an unnatural rigidity, almost like it had been caught mid-step. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as I stared into the dark. Nothing, just the forest and the dull thrum of my heartbeat. My hands were shaking as I started to drive again. The headlights barely cut through the twilight, and I swerved as I caught another glimpse of the figure, this time closer to the road. It was at the edge of my vision, a blur of movement. I didn't know if I should stop or keep going, but the road was empty behind me, and I couldn't risk turning around. Suddenly, my car's engine sputtered, and I watched in horror as the lights dimmed and then cut out altogether. The cabin of the car was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the relentless thumping of my heart. I reached for my flashlight, feeling my palms turn cold as I fumbled to turn it on. A knock came from the driver's side window. My body froze, but my eyes went straight to the glass. A hand was pressed against it, long fingers reaching out with an unsettling rigidity. The skin looked rough, cracked, and speckled with dark patches. A face emerged, impossibly thin, with eyes that were wide and unblinking. It had a smile, but it was wrong. It was stretched too far, as though someone had pulled the corners of its mouth with hooks. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at the figure, but it was already retreating, melting back into the trees. The light illuminated the forest just long enough for me to catch sight of more figures. They emerged from the shadows like marionettes, limbs moving in angles they shouldn't, heads tilting back as if looking at something invisible. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. There was none. The figures started to close in, moving with a quick, unnatural shuffle. I unlocked the car door, my fingers trembling, and I stepped out into the gravel. The night air was sharp, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of branches snapping as the figures came closer. Then, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as the vehicle pulled up, and a man stepped out, his face lit with concern. "Are you all right?" he called, glancing around nervously. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the figures, the terror clawing at my throat. The man followed my gaze and looked back at me with wide, horrified eyes. "They're already here," he whispered, and then he was running, disappearing into the forest. The figures paused, their heads turning in unison to follow him, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they were all heading in the same direction toward the road where I had just been. My car roared to life as if in response, and I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures at the edge of the woods, watching. Their twisted faces held that same, stretched smile, and as they faded into the trees, I could almost hear them whispering a single word: "Run." I had been driving for hours, taking the long way home from a visit to my grandparents. The farmland stretched out on either side of the road, a patchwork of fields that seemed to go on forever. With every turn, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to catch me. I was almost home when I noticed the old, rusted tractor sitting off to the side of the road. It hadn't been there before, and I found myself slowing down to take a closer look. The engine was covered in dirt, and weeds had grown up around its tires, like it had been abandoned years ago. I couldn't remember ever seeing it there, and I would have remembered, because I had driven down that road countless times. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure standing behind my car. The road was empty, and the fields were quiet except for the rustle of dry corn stalks in the wind. I scoffed at myself, muttering that I was being paranoid, and drove on. Just as I was about to turn onto my street, a strange noise caught my attention. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding on a hollow drum. I pulled to a stop, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise seemed to be coming from the field to my left, where the corn had grown tall and thick, forming an almost impenetrable wall. I stared into the dark expanse, my pulse quickening. The thumping was joined by an odd, gurgling sound, like water bubbling up through mud. A shiver raced down my spine as I realized the noise was moving, shifting closer to the road. I backed up a few feet, my eyes wide as I watched the edge of the field ripple like the surface of a pond. Then I saw it, a figure, distorted and half hidden by the corn stalks. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. I slammed the car into reverse and peeled away from the field, the thumping and gurgling growing louder behind me. My tires skidded as I spun around the corner and raced down my street. I didn't dare look back, but my rearview mirror showed the edge of the field, swaying as if something large had stepped into the road. My hands were shaking as I pulled into my driveway and jumped out, not waiting for the car to come to a complete stop. The front door creaked as I fumbled with my keys, barely managing to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my back against it as my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thumping had stopped, but now there was a new sound of scraping, as if something with long, sharp claws was dragging itself along the edge of the field. I peeked through the window, my heart leaping into my throat when I saw a shadow move past the porch light. It was tall, with limbs that stretched too far, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. I could only see the edge of it, but I didn't need to see more to know that whatever was out there was not human. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. The call didn't go through. I tried again, the screen showing a no-service message. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming up the steps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to think of what I should do. I had no weapon, no way of defending myself. The sound stopped just outside the door, and then a soft, wet thud followed by a dragging sound. I backed away, holding my breath as I watched the doorknob twist and shift, as if something was trying to turn it from the outside. The wood groaned as pressure was applied, and I feared it wouldn't hold. Suddenly, the pressure eased, and the sound of footsteps receded, fading back into the night. My heart pounded, but the silence was deafening. I waited, unable to move, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the field in a harsh, bright light. There was no sign of what I had seen. The next morning, I found the front steps littered with long, dark claw marks, deep enough to splinter the wood, and when I looked out at the field, the cornstalks had been flattened, as if something heavy had moved through them. But most disturbing of all was the fresh, muddy handprint pressed against the window. It started with a simple invitation: a weekend trip to the lake. A friend of mine had rented an old boathouse by the water, a place where families used to go decades ago before it fell into disrepair. The photos she sent showed a charming, rustic building with peeling paint and weathered wood, a quaint escape from our busy lives. I was hesitant, but the promise of clear skies and warm summer nights was too tempting to pass up. When we arrived, it was everything I expected, quiet and isolated. The boathouse was perched at the edge of a small, serene lake surrounded by pines. The water was dark and calm, with just the occasional ripple from a fish or a breeze. It was perfect. We spent the first day swimming, eating grilled food, and laughing until our sides hurt. As the sun set, we sat on the old dock, feet dangling in the cool water. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, and the stars began to blink into existence above us. We shared stories and let the night embrace us. The trouble started as the moon crested over the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining it a movement at the edge of the water, something slithering just below the surface. It looked like a shadow shifting beneath the lake, but it was too large to be just a fish. I pointed it out, but no one else saw it. They laughed, saying I was tired, seeing things, but the movement didn't stop. I watched, transfixed, as the shadow seemed to grow, twisting and pulsing beneath the surface. It was then that I noticed the sound, the soft, wet scraping of something brushing against the wooden posts of the dock, almost like a faint whisper. I stood up, heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The laughter stopped. We all listened, and that's when we heard it, a deep, low gurgle from under the water, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across the boards. A chill settled into my bones. I backed up as the water near the edge of the dock rippled, and then something broke the surface. It was dark and slick, like oil, and it moved like a snake, but with long, skeletal limbs that reached out and curled toward us. We screamed and scrambled to the shore, my feet barely finding purchase on the slick rocks. One of my friends tripped, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought she'd be dragged back into the lake. But she caught herself, and we all stumbled up the path leading to the boathouse. We slammed the door shut, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity, only the sound of our ragged breathing filling the small room. I glanced out the cracked window and saw that the water was now perfectly still again, reflecting the moon like glass. We didn't sleep that night, huddled together and watching the water, expecting the creature to return. It was only as dawn approached that we dared to let out a collective breath. But when we looked out again, there was no sign of anything unusual. The lake was just a lake, calm, quiet, and innocent. It wasn't until we were packing to leave that I noticed something on the dock. The boathouse was perched at the edge of a small, serene lake surrounded by pines. The water was dark and calm, with just the occasional ripple from a fish or a breeze. It was perfect. We spent the first day swimming, eating grilled food, and laughing until our sides hurt. As the sun set, we sat on the old dock, feet dangling in the cool water. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, and the stars began to blink into existence above us. We shared stories and let the night embrace us. The trouble started as the moon crested over the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining it a movement at the edge of the water, something slithering just below the surface. It looked like a shadow shifting beneath the lake, but it was too large to be just a fish. I pointed it out, but no one else saw it. They laughed, saying I was tired, seeing things, but the movement didn't stop. I watched, transfixed, as the shadow seemed to grow, twisting and pulsing beneath the surface. I never thought a simple trip to the county fair would lead to a night I couldn't forget. The fairgrounds were full of lights and music, the sounds of laughter mingling with the creak of carnival rides. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind that makes you feel alive. My best friend and I had come to eat cotton candy, play games, and ride the Ferris wheel. We were there to have fun. Nothing more. We wandered through the fair, stopping at booths and laughing as I tried to win a stuffed animal from a claw machine. We moved from ride to ride, each one a mix of joy and adrenaline. As the night grew older, the crowds began to thin, the lights reflecting in puddles left by the day's rain. That's when we saw a sign for an attraction we hadn't noticed before, a large tent with wonders of the unseen written across the entrance in faded, curving letters. I nudged my friend and said, "Why not? We haven't tried anything like this yet." He hesitated but agreed, and we stepped into the tent. The air was cool, the scent of damp canvas mixed with something metallic. Inside, a dimly lit space stretched before us, with rows of oddities on pedestals and glass cases. There were strange sculptures, eyes that seemed to watch you, and jars containing things that looked too grotesque to name. We wandered further, entranced by the bizarre display, until I noticed a small, unmarked glass case in the corner. Inside was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Never turn your back on the silent one." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at my friend. He was staring at the case with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before I could reply, a sound came from the back of the tent. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to draw closer. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes, as if the entire tent had shifted, as if it were holding its breath. A sudden scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere in the dark. My friend's hand gripped mine so hard that it hurt, but I didn't dare look away from the shifting shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Go, now!" The voice came from behind us. I spun around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a hood. The eyes that peered out from under the fabric were black and deep, a void that seemed to pull at my mind. The whisper came again. "Leave this place. Leave now." I yanked my friend toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch, the entrance impossibly far away. We stumbled over discarded objects and felt the air grow colder. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened, a wet, dragging shuffle. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it getting closer, an unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst through the entrance and into the moonlit fairgrounds. The lights seemed brighter, the noise of the music and laughter louder, as if we had just woken up from a nightmare. We ran to the nearest food stand, gasping for breath, eyes darting back to the entrance of the tent. It was empty. The sign for Wonders of the Unseen now looked torn and tattered, barely hanging on its posts. The tent had vanished, leaving only a dark patch of ground where it once stood. We didn't speak about what had happened that night. It was easier not to, but every now and then, when I hear a sound in the dark or feel something move just out of sight, I remember the whisper, the eyes, and the figure that stood in the shadows. Never turn your back on the silent one, and I know it's still out there. The first time I noticed it, I was alone in the park. It was a warm spring evening, the kind that makes you forget the stress of daily life and think that maybe everything's going to be okay. I sat on one of the old benches, staring out at the lake as the last rays of sunlight bounced off the water's surface. The sound of children playing in the distance and the soft rustling of the leaves should have been comforting, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. The park was nearly empty, save for an old man who was feeding the ducks and a young couple holding hands near the picnic tables. As the sun sank lower, a strange quiet fell over the area, almost as if the world was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the figure standing on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it was a shadow. It was tall, unmoving, with the outline of a person, but it was shrouded in darkness. Even though the last golden rays of sunlight still clung to the trees, I squinted, my heart beginning to pound as I realized the figure was staring straight at me. I looked away quickly, telling myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I glanced back a moment later, it was closer, just barely, but unmistakably so. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood up and started walking toward the park exit. My pace quickened as I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew I was being followed. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the park was safe, but each step I took felt heavier, like the air around me was thickening, making it harder to move. I reached the gates and glanced back. The figure was no longer just standing, it was now moving, fast and awkward, like its limbs were too long and bent in unnatural ways. It wasn't running, but it moved quickly, closing the distance in a way that made me feel hunted. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock it. The screen stayed black, no matter how hard I pressed. My stomach twisted in fear, and I forced myself to break into a run, charging toward the street where the lights were brighter and the cars passed with a reassuring hum. I didn't dare look behind me. I reached the sidewalk, gasping, but I couldn't stop running. Only when I heard the sound of tires screeching around a corner did I turn my head. The figure was still at the edge of the park, staring at me, unmoving once more. I caught the gleam of its eyes that seemed far too wide, almost like they'd been carved into its face. A car honked, startling me, and I spun away, hurling myself into the street. I barely caught sight of the driver's panicked face before the headlights blinded me, and I screamed. Everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed hours later, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nose. I could hear people talking outside the room, muffled and distant. My head throbbed, but I sat up as best I could, trying to remember what had happened. A nurse came in and smiled sympathetically. "You're awake. You were hit by a car, but you're okay. Just a concussion. Some scrapes. You're lucky." I wanted to tell her about the figure, how it had followed me, but when I tried to speak, my throat felt dry, and words didn't come. Something else caught my eye, and I froze. The window was open a crack, and on the ledge, a smear of dark red was visible, as if someone had pressed a hand there and left it behind. And then I noticed it. Out there in the dark, just past the glass, was a shape long, thin, and impossibly bent. It tilted its head, as if looking straight at me, eyes wide and gleaming in the moonlight. The nurse turned at the sound of my gasp, but the figure was already gone, leaving only a trail of red footprints leading into the night. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep, fiery orange when I arrived at my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed years ago, but I still visited their home to keep the place in good shape. My parents were out of town, and I thought it would be the perfect time to finish up some repairs and enjoy the peace and quiet of the country. The house was surrounded by fields of tall corn that creaked in the wind. The soft, rhythmic rustling made for a strange sort of comfort as I walked through the yard. But, as the night deepened, that comfort began to twist into something else, something cold. I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the sink when I heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic thud, as if something were tapping against the side of the house. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind against the wood. But then the thudding grew louder and more insistent, moving around the perimeter of the house. My heart skipped a beat as I turned off the tap and listened intently. The noise came from the back of the house, near the barn. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating the yard in jagged strips of silver and black. I took a step outside, the air suddenly colder. The crickets had stopped singing, and the wind had died down to a whisper. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. I aimed the flashlight at the barn and froze. The door, which had always hung slightly ajar, was now wide open, creaking as it swayed gently in the breeze. And standing in the doorway was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then the figure moved, a tall, thin silhouette with long arms and a head that was too large for its body. It shifted, like it was trying to get a better look at me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a step back. The barn door creaked again, this time louder, as if something had stepped forward into the moonlight. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was then that I realized the figure was holding something. A long, curved blade that caught the light and reflected it in a way that made my skin prickle. It pointed the blade at me, then tilted its head, as if curious. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over a rock. My flashlight hit the ground and rolled, the beam sweeping over the cornfield that surrounded the property. The movement caught my attention. There were more of them, figures emerging from between the stalks. Tall, thin shapes, all with strange, twisted limbs and empty eyes that glowed a pale blue in the moonlight. My breath quickened. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight. The figure in the barn didn't move, but the others in the cornfield did, closing in around the house. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like lead. I aimed the beam of the flashlight at the nearest one, and it flinched back, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a low, wet growl. I bolted toward the front of the house, racing past the porch and slamming my hand against the door. It creaked open just as I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The old lock clicked into place, and I pressed my back against the wood, gasping for breath. The thudding returned, only now it was inside, pounding against the walls and floor like 100 feet, shuffling over the old wood. I turned and grabbed a rusty old poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white as I gripped it. Then the whisper came, so soft I almost didn't hear it. A voice, as thin as the wind, whispering in the dark, "Not done. Not done." I spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the window, eyes wide and glowing like the figures outside. It mouthed the same words, over and over, and that's when I realized, whatever these things were, they were waiting for me to step outside. They wanted me to leave, to join them under the moonlight. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the cold silence of the night. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient wood creaking in time with my heartbeat. I dared a glance outside and saw nothing but the moonlit corn, swaying gently in the wind, but I knew they were still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment I might open a door or step out of the safety of the house. And I knew I would never forget their eyes, those cold, empty eyes that glowed in the dark. The night my world change started like any other. My friends and I had decided to take an evening trip to the old observatory on the hill. It had been closed for years, abandoned. The last astronomer mysteriously vanished. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but we were young and reckless, ready for any thrill. We didn't believe the stories. The climb up the hill was steep and damp from an earlier rain, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine. The observatory loomed above us, its weathered stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy that reached out like fingers. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars, and the moon cast a ghostly glow over everything. Inside, the observatory was dark and silent. The main dome creaked under the weight of time, the giant telescope pointing skyward like a skeletal finger. We wandered through, laughing and daring each other to explore deeper into the building. It wasn't until we reached the old basement that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped, and a metallic scent filled the air. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity pushed us forward. The basement was full of old equipment, charts, and abandoned papers scattered like leaves. At the far end was a door, half open, with the faint light seeping through the cracks. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old photographs and a large, moth-eaten chair, but the strangest part was the mirror. It was an antique, with a frame carved from dark wood and intricate patterns that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. I stepped closer, feeling a chill creep over my skin. "Hey, come on," Emily called from behind. "Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as I moved, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Only, it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. It grinned, but it was not my smile. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if something were pressing against my chest. A sound, like the faintest whisper, moved through the room. My friends crowded around, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What is it?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Before I could answer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer just a face, it was an entire scene, a vivid replay of a moment I didn't recognize. A man, hunched over and gasping, in the very room we stood in. His reflection stared at me, eyes wide with terror, as if he knew I was watching him. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, fingers splayed, as though trying to pull me in, get away from it. Emily screamed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room shuddered, the floor creaking as though it were about to split open. A cold wind surged past me, carrying with it a voice that echoed in my mind. "Help me." I snapped back to reality, stumbling away from the mirror as it cracked, the glass shattering in a spray of sharp, jagged pieces. The chill lifted, and the room returned to its stillness. My friends were staring at me, fear radiating off them like heat. "What did you see?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked around, not sure how to answer. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, waiting for me to return. We left the basement without speaking, the silence heavy between us. When we finally stepped out into the open night, the stars above felt colder, the moon more watchful. I never went back to that observatory, none of us did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch my reflection in a dark window and see a pale, hollow-eyed face grinning at me from the glass. It's not just a reflection, it's waiting. The first time I noticed something was off was when I walked into the old public library. It was the middle of the day, yet the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of dust and decay, with a hint of something sweet that I couldn't quite place. I usually loved the library, the hush of turning pages, the creak of wooden floors, the musty scent of old books, but that day felt different. I wasn't alone. A few people sat scattered among the aisles, some flipping through books and others simply staring blankly at the walls. I wandered past the rows of bookshelves, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as if in sync with my growing unease. As I passed a section of history books, I heard a faint whisper. My pulse quickened, but when I turned, there was no one around. I let out a nervous chuckle and shook my head. I had been up all night studying. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I moved deeper into the library, drawn to the old, oversized books in the corner. As I reached for one, a chill ran down my spine. The book was open, resting on a table, pages yellowed and stained. But it was the words that caught my attention. "Don't look behind you," I scoffed, dismissing it as some sick joke. But as I glanced over my shoulder, the whispering started again. This time, I heard it clearer, as though it was spoken directly into my ear. "Don't look behind you." I spun around, heart pounding, and locked eyes with an elderly man sitting across the room. He was hunched over, his gnarled fingers playing with the edge of a book, eyes glistening with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the look in his eyes, it was the way he seemed to lean forward, as if trying to warn me. But his lips never moved. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a rustling like pages being turned. I whipped around to see that all the books around me had fallen open, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. A cold draft swept through the aisle, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The man's voice came again, clearer this time, though still soft and broken. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off, plunging the room into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I stood in the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just a power outage. My breathing echoed off the high ceilings as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen was dead. A soft, steady tapping began behind me, a rhythmic sound like fingernails on wood. I turned, and in the darkness, a thin, shadowy figure stood at the end of the aisle, just at the edge of the light from the window. Its eyes were wide and hollow, and a grin stretched across its face, too wide to be human. Panic surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, stumbling through the rows of books as they fell around me. I could hear the whispering behind me, growing louder, weaving through the air like a song I couldn't recognize. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the figure moving toward me, feet gliding silently over the floor. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, gasping for air as the sound of whispering finally faded. I dared to look back once, but the library was dark, as if nothing had happened at all. I swore I could still hear the faintest voice saying, "You should have listened," to this day. I never go near that library again, and when I pass it, I can still hear the soft, whispering voice calling out from inside, warning me of the one thing I wish I'd known. Once you hear the library's secrets, you can never leave. The summer evenings were always warm, but there was a strange bite in the air that night. I had been out for a late walk in the fields behind the old farmhouse. The path was familiar. I had grown up here, the creaking fence and the wildflowers like old friends. But tonight felt different. The crickets were silent, and the usual hum of nature seemed to be holding its breath. I reached the old well at the edge of the field, a spot I hadn't visited in years. The well was covered with a rusty grate, the metal bent and weathered. I paused, staring down into its dark mouth, half expecting to hear the splash of water or the distant drip of something unseen. Instead, I heard a low, rhythmic thumping. I stepped back, my heart pounding. It came from behind me, a sound like someone walking on dry leaves. I spun around, breath caught in my throat, but there was no one. Just the wind pushing the tall grass in ripples. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again, soft steps, coming from the direction of the farmhouse. I took off running, faster than I had in years, past the fields and through the orchard. The branches of the apple trees clawed at my arms, and the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I glanced back and saw nothing, but that thumping sound had followed me, close enough to make my pulse race. I reached the house, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. The old wood shuddered under the weight of my panic. My grandmother's clock ticked on the wall, its second hand moving with a deliberate slowness, mocking me. I forced myself to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it had just been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I was just about to turn on the radio to break the silence when I heard it. The thumping had stopped. Now there was a slow, dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the porch outside. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, pausing right at the front door. I glanced around the room, searching for something to defend myself with. My fingers found the edge of a heavy iron candlestick, and I gripped it tightly as the sound moved from the porch to the side of the house. I could hear breathing now, shallow and ragged, like something was trying to catch its breath. The silence returned, broken only by the beat of my heart and the ticking of the clock. I dared to look out the side window, the one that faced the barn, and I saw a shadow moving in the moonlight. It was too big to be a person. It was to unnatural. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, and for a split second, I could see a dark figure standing there, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. The shape tilted its head up to look at me through the window, and even from a distance, I could see the smile stretched wide across its face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. I stumbled back, the candlestick clattering to the floor. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, "Never turn your back on the dark," but that was impossible now. The creature moved forward, and the air grew cold as frost started to creep along the window pane. A sudden crash from the front of the house made me spin around. The door splintered as something slammed into it, but the lock held. I could see the creature at the window now, its eyes locked on mine, black and wet like oil. It reached out, fingers stretching in impossible ways, scraping against the glass with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The clock stopped, mid-tick. The room went dark, the silence deep and suffocating. Then, I heard the voice, soft and hollow, like it was coming from under the floorboards. "Let me in." I took a deep breath and bolted for the back door, grabbing my coat and running out into the night. The wind picked up, and the sound of the creature behind me was drowned out by a roar like 100 voices crying out at once. I didn't look back until I reached the road, my legs trembling and my chest burning. I glanced over my shoulder, but the house was empty, silent once more, and the field behind it was blanketed in shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached town, and even then, I never spoke of that night to anyone. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure: it was waiting for me, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. I hadn't planned on taking the shortcut through the old park that evening. It was late, just past sunset, and I was already tired from the long day. But as I glanced at the road ahead, I realized the shortcut would get me home faster. The park was empty. As usual, no lights, no children's laughter, nothing to break the silence of the early evening. The path was narrow, bordered by overgrown bushes and the skeletal branches of old trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept my eyes on the path. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. That's when I heard the first noise, a soft, rhythmic thumping. I stopped, heart clenching. It came from deeper in the park, a few yards off the main path. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but then it grew louder, a thudding that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I hesitated. I could turn around, go back to the road, but the thumping was joined by another sound, faint but unmistakable, a child's giggle. It was high-pitched and cheerful, like the kind of laugh that would echo through a playground, but there were no children in the park. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. I forced my feet forward, telling myself I was just imagining things. The thumping continued, and the giggle grew louder. I passed an old, rusted swing set, its chains creaking as if moved by an unseen hand. My breath quickened as I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, and for a moment, I saw a figure small, dressed in white, standing at the edge of the woods. Its face was obscured by a curtain of hair. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I ran like I was being chased, the echoes of my footfalls mingling with the sounds behind me. The thumping had turned into pounding, a sound that seemed to follow me, no matter how fast I moved. I broke out of the park and onto the road, panting, my chest burning. The streetlights flickered on, casting their orange glow on the pavement. I dared a glance behind me, half expecting to see the figure from the woods. There was nothing, only the empty path winding through the park. When I reached my street, I didn't stop to check my mail or even look around. I dashed into my house, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it just in case. I stood there, trembling, telling myself it was just a bad dream, that the park was empty, that I was safe. The silence in the house was thick and absolute. But then I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping, coming from outside my window. I looked out, heart slamming into my ribs, and there it was. The figure from the park, standing in the yard, staring at me. It tilted its head, and a smile spread across its face, a smile so wide, so impossibly twisted, that I felt sick. I backed away from the window, my fingers fumbling for my phone, but the thumping came again, louder this time, as if the ground itself were shaking. I glanced at my reflection in the glass, and for just a moment, I saw not my own terrified face, but that of a child, eyes wide and filled with dread. Then the window shattered. I don't remember running or what happened after that. I only know that the thumping, the giggling, and the figure were gone when I came to my senses, sprawled in my living room, the cold night air biting at my skin. The police found nothing when they came. No broken glass, no evidence of anyone in the yard. Just an empty house and a story I would never tell. Not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, but because I knew, deep down, that the next time I heard that thumping, it would be much, much closer. The summer I turned 18, my cousins and I decided to spend the weekend at their grandparents' old farm. The house was on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and a patch of forest on one side. I had spent summers there when I was younger, but this time felt different. The place was darker. Somehow, even in the middle of the day, we arrived around mid-afternoon. The farm had a rusted, creaky metal gate that looked like it might fall apart if you touched it, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded. It had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. After we settled in, we explored the property, climbing trees, poking around the old barn, and chasing each other through the long grass. The scent of hay and earth clung to the air, sweet and sharp dot. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky deepened into a rich, bruised blue. That was when we noticed the sound. It started as a low rumble from the woods behind the house, like the growl of distant thunder. But it wasn't quite right. It had a steady, pulsing rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. We looked at each other, nervous laughter escaping us as we tried to dismiss it. Probably just some wild animal, my cousin Peter said, though his voice wavered. But the noise grew louder, and we started hearing whispers, thin and rustling, coming from the woods. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to the noise, like someone was walking through the underbrush, trying to stay hidden but failing. We huddled together, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we go back inside when the air turned colder, and a shadow fell across the yard. A figure stepped out of the forest. It was thin and bent, its limbs moving in jerky motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and its face came into view. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were dark pits, as if they had been carved out. A low, rasping breath escaped its mouth, and it tilted its head, like it was studying us. Double quotes run. I whispered. We bolted for the house, hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the figure shuffling behind us, the leaves crunching underfoot. We slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as the figure reached it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sharp, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the door. We huddled in the dark, staring at the thin sliver of light under the door. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. I felt a rush of cold air move across my skin, as though something was just inches away. The sound of scraping shifted to a loud thump. And then it stopped. We dared to breathe again, the fear making us dizzy. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My cousins whispered about calling for help, but the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed and hanging limply. Suddenly, A soft knock came from the back door. Peter glanced at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's inside." We moved as a group to the kitchen, every step echoing in the silent house. I peeked through the cracked door, and the sight made my blood freeze. The figure was standing on the porch, staring at us through the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink. But then, its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and it spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "You shouldn't have come back." We backed away, the noise of the night outside pressing in around us. The whispers returned, but this time, they were joined by a second voice, then a third. Shapes began to form in the windows, figures pressing their faces against the glass, eyes black and hollow. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the yard at dawn, the others scattered around me. The house was silent, its doors and windows closed, as if nothing had happened. We checked every room, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound at all. But when I went to the window and looked out at the woods, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And I knew that, whatever had been there, it hadn't left. The road to the old farmhouse was long and winding, a forgotten path that cut through fields of tall grass and gnarled oaks. I had never been out to the farm before, but my friend Aaron had convinced me to join him on this trip to visit his grandparents. They were out of town, and he thought it would be fun to spend the weekend there, exploring and getting away from the city that had started out as a joke between us, a way to break up the monotony of our usual weekend routine. But, as the sun sank below the horizon, the light slipping into dark shadows, an unease settled over me. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field, its old wooden panels darkened with age. Windows that had once been bright and inviting now cracked and dusty. We explored the house in the fading light, peering into rooms filled with old, rusting tools and faded photographs of a family that felt like a ghostly memory. I touched a picture frame that showed a woman and a man with a young child, their smiles warm and familiar. But it was the eyes that made me stop. They looked familiar, almost like they were staring back at me. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. Aaron laughed, his voice bouncing through the empty house. He was already upstairs, calling out for me to check out the attic. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I climbed up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, suffocating with the scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if someone else was up there with us. "Look at this," Aaron said, holding a dusty lantern aloft. The light flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stepped closer and saw an old, moth-eaten trunk. He opened it, and inside were old clothes, some toys, and a small diary with pages that looked like they could crumble with a single touch. I reached out and flipped it open, not expecting anything more than gibberish. But the words leapt off the page, written in a scrawled, frantic hand. "They come when the lights go out." They were the faces of those who were here before. The air around me grew colder, and I heard Aaron let out a sharp breath behind me. The lantern flickered again, and I spun around, the light catching his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open, but it wasn't just surprise that I saw. It was fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old house as if it were trying to break in. A low thud sounded below us, and then a muffled voice, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. My body tensed, and I felt a shiver race up my spine. "Aaron, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when I looked at him, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something that moved in the darkened corner of the attic. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The shadow moved, a shape that was impossible and familiar at once, a face. It had the same features as the one in the picture downstairs, but it wasn't a photograph anymore. It was real, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisting into a grin. I stumbled back, and the lantern fell from Aaron's hands, landing with a crash that shattered the glass and sent sparks skittering across the wooden floor. The room erupted into darkness, but I could still feel it moving closer, slow and deliberate. "Run!" Aaron shouted. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. The voice below grew louder, now unmistakable a child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before, followed by the soft sound of feet pattering on the floor above. we reached the front door, wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The moon was a pale slice in the sky, illuminating the fields that stretched out in front of us. We didn't stop to look back as we ran across the grass, the song still echoing behind us, chased by the sound of footsteps and a voice that whispered my name. When we reached the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The farmhouse loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless, but I saw something in the window on the second floor. A child's face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and hollow, watching us as we ran away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hearts pounding and breathless. I never told anyone what happened that night, and Aaron never spoke of it again. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that house, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard the voice. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. They come when the lights go out. The village was nestled between rolling hills and surrounded by dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where stories traveled faster than the wind, and where no one questioned the traditions that kept the community safe. Or so they thought. I had just moved to the village with my husband, hoping for a peaceful life away from the noise of the city. The people were welcoming, the scenery was beautiful, and the air had a crisp, clean smell. But there was always a whisper that wound its way through the market square, an undercurrent of unease. It was on a foggy afternoon that I first heard it. I had been in the village square, chatting with the baker when an old man passed by. His clothes were ragged, and his eyes seemed clouded, as if he had seen too much and too little at the same time. He muttered something under his breath, a chant that made my blood run cold. When the sun sets, the silence comes. And when the silence comes, they return. I didn't think much of it until I was out walking that evening, the sky turning deep purple and the forest casting long, wavering shadows. I took a path that led me through the woods, wanting to find a spot to clear my mind. The quiet was almost too much, pressing down on me, making my pulse quicken. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a deep growl coming from somewhere deep within the trees. I turned, but there was no one, just the maze of trunks and leaves. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a boar. I took a deep breath and pressed forward. The path wound tighter, the trees growing thicker. As the shadows deepened, I came upon a small clearing. The silence was so profound it almost hurt, and then I saw it, an old stone altar covered in moss and strange carvings. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer, brushing my fingers over the carvings. They were ancient symbols, twisted and unfamiliar. A sudden rustling made me spin around, eyes wide. A figure emerged from the woods, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs elongated and its face a pale, hollow mask with eyes that seemed to pulse in the dark. It opened its mouth, and the sound of a deep, bone-chilling howl ripped through the air. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and falling hard. My head cracked against the ground, and the world blurred around me. The figure stood over me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. Before I could scream, the howl came again, closer this time, and then another, and another, until the clearing was filled with the low, guttural chorus of those things that roamed in the dark. Suddenly, the silence shattered with the voice of the old man from the village. The silence comes, and they return, he shouted from the edge of the woods, his voice frenzied. The creatures were circling me, eyes glistening, their breaths ragged and unnatural. They were closing in, but then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped, their heads tilted back in unison, their mouths parting in a silent, screeching cry that sent a jolt of terror down my spine. And then I heard it, an ear-splitting, high-pitched sound that seemed to come from the forest itself. The creatures shuddered, their movements jerky and chaotic as they stumbled backward. One by one, they fell, as if yanked by invisible hands, their bodies crumpling into the underbrush. I scrambled to my feet, eyes wide, and looked around to see the old man standing there, his face pale and eyes wet with something I couldn't name. "They won't come back tonight," he said, his voice shaking. "But the silence always comes, and when it does, they are waiting." I didn't stay to ask questions. I ran, stumbling over roots and tripping over fallen branches until I broke through the tree line, gasping for breath. The village was still asleep, the sky slowly lightening as dawn approached. I glanced back, but the clearing and the altar were gone, swallowed by the woods as if they had never existed. For days, I tried to understand what I had seen, but the village folk never spoke of the old altar, the creatures, or the silence. They only whispered that when the sun set, the silence would come, and with it, they would return. And now I know why. Every time the forest falls quiet, my heart fills with dread. Because deep in the woods, the silence waits, and with it, something else waits too. It was an ordinary evening when I decided to visit the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. I'd heard rumors that it had been closed for years, that strange things happened there, but I was bored and curious. The park looked harmless enough from the outside, a relic of happier days with its rusting rides and cracked pavement. I walked through the entrance gate, which hung at a crooked angle and creaked as I pushed it open. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence swallowed me. No chirping crickets, no sound of the breeze, just a dead, suffocating quiet that settled like a weight on my chest. I glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to step out from behind one of the weathered booths or from the broken-down carousel. But nothing moved. I wandered down the main path, passing by the Ferris wheel, which loomed above like an iron giant. The paint on the seats had peeled away, leaving them a mottled gray, and they swayed slightly, as if moved by an invisible hand. I shivered, but kept walking. The first odd thing happened when I approached the bumper car arena. A dull, metallic thud resonated behind me, and I spun around to find nothing but shadows. I told myself it was the wind, that I was being paranoid, but the sound had been too distinct to ignore. A sense of dread started to creep in, but I pressed forward. I couldn't be afraid of an empty amusement park, could I? I reached the fun house and stood at the entrance for a moment, debating whether or not I should go in. The wind picked up again, sending a cold draft down the corridor of warped mirrors. The laughter of children echoed from inside, but it sounded wrong, off-key, like a warped recording. I should have turned back, but my feet were moving before I could stop them. Inside, the air was stifling, and the floors creaked beneath my weight. The funhouse had been neglected for years, its walls covered in grime, the once colorful lights dim and flickering. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow flit past in the corner of the room. A sudden crash behind me made me spin around, heart racing. I caught a glimpse of something small and fast darting out of sight. My pulse quickened as I ran, not caring about the twists and turns or the strange, laughing echoes that followed me. I needed to get out, to be away from whatever had just been in there. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for air. The cool night greeted me, but there was no relief. The silence that had swallowed the park was now punctuated by an unsettling giggle. I turned to see the carousel, the horses once bright with paint now dull and covered in moss, but one of them moved. Its head twisted to look at me, eyes wide and hollow, the once friendly smile replaced with something that looked like a snarl. I screamed, backing away as the laughter grew louder, joined by more, until it was a chorus of whispers and high-pitched giggles that surrounded me. My eyes locked onto the entrance I had come through. I bolted, my heart thundering as I passed the crooked gate, the laughter fading behind me like a cruel echo. I ran until I could no longer hear the noise, until the normal sounds of the town returned to me. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that laugh, the one that came from the twisted carousel horse that watched me as I fled. I'd never been to my grandparents' house during the winter. They lived on an old farm at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods that stretched out like dark, gnarled fingers. It was late December, and the snow had started falling as we pulled into the long gravel driveway. My parents had decided we should visit for Christmas, and while the air was festive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house was beautiful in its own way, with its peeling paint and creaking porch. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and the faded scent of old books. We gathered around the fireplace, my grandparents smiling warmly as they passed out hot chocolate and cookies. I was still trying to shake off the strange feeling from the ride when my grandfather pointed out the window. "Look at that," he said, a hint of worrying in his voice. I turned and saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but it looked like a person, hunched over, watching us. Is someone out there? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. My parents exchanged glances, and my grandmother's eyes narrowed. It's probably just the wind, she said, but the wind didn't move like that. It didn't stand still and stare. After dinner, my parents decided to turn in early, and my grandparents suggested I stay up with them for a while. I hesitated but agreed. We sat by the fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The snow had picked up outside, and I watched it swirl past the window in thick white sheets. Suddenly, there came a knock at the door, a sharp, loud sound that made me jump. My grandfather stood, his face shadowed but his eyes intense. He walked over and opened the door, the cold air rushing in. There was no one there. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice trembling. Go to bed, son, my grandfather said, but there was a tremor in his voice I'd never heard before. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced me. I nodded and went up to the room they had set up for me, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the moonlight filtering through the window, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside. But then I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on glass. It came from the window. I sat up, eyes fixed on the snow-covered pane, and then I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, pressed against the glass from the other side, followed by another, and then a face distorted, hollow-eyed, with a mouth that split open in an eerie, wide grin. It was looking right at me, and even through the glass, I could see the hollow, black void where its eyes should have been. My heart pounded, my vision blurred with panic. I backed away from the window, but the tapping didn't stop. It moved around the room, slow and deliberate, as if circling me, searching for an entrance. I scrambled for my phone, but it was dead, the battery drained from the cold. I grabbed the quilt off the bed and wrapped it around me, holding my breath as the tapping moved away. I waited, listening for the sound to stop, for the night to return to silence. But then I heard a voice, faint and echoing, come outside. It wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a voice that made my skin prickle and my blood run cold. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to disappear into the shadows as the tapping grew louder, this time coming from the door. The door creaked open, and I glimpsed a shape in the moonlight, a figure with elongated limbs, eyes black as coal, and that impossibly wide, sinister grin. I don't remember running or how I ended up outside, barefoot in the snow. But when I looked back, the figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind and the quiet crunch of snow underfoot. The next morning, I told my grandparents everything. They looked at each other, worrying in their eyes, and my grandfather said something I'll never forget. That's not the first time it's been seen, but it won't come in unless you invite it. I never went back to that house again. But sometimes, when the snow falls and the night is still, I hear the faint tapping against my window, as if it's trying to get inside. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable, but I couldn't complain. I was finally visiting my grandmother's farm for the summer, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child. My parents said she had been lonely, so I decided to take a break from my busy city life and spend the next 2 weeks out in the open fields. The bus dropped me off in front of the weathered farmhouse, the wood painted appealing red that clashed with the green of the fields. I smiled, inhaling the crisp, dry air, trying to drown out the nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. Grandma was waiting for me on the porch. Her hair was white, her smile wide and welcoming. We hugged, and she took my bags inside. The first few days were idyllic. Long walks through the meadows, fresh milk from the cows, and evenings spent on the porch as the sun sank into a horizon of tall, whispering corn stalks. But as the days wore on, I noticed the odd things. At night, when the world was dark and silent, I would hear a faint tapping sound, like a pebble hitting the window. I'd wake up, heart racing, and see only shadows in the moonlight. Grandma assured me it was just the wind, or the old house settling, but I didn't believe her. It wasn't just the tapping, there was something else. Something moving in the fields, just beyond the reach of the porch light. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up, breathless, listening. The noise came closer, slow and heavy, until it stopped. My heart pounded. I slipped into my shoes and crept to the window. The moonlight spilled across the land, casting everything in a cold, silvery glow. I gasped when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, unmoving. It was tall, impossibly so, with thin limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted back, and its eyes were nothing but dark, hollow pits. I blinked and it was gone, vanished into the maze of stalks. My mind raced. It was too dark, too far for me to see clearly. I shivered, questioning my sanity. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the moonlight. I turned to find Grandma asleep in her chair, breathing steady and deep. But when I looked at the clock, I noticed the time, 3:27 a.m., the same time the tapping had started, the same time the footsteps came. The next day, the sun hung heavy in the sky as I worked with Grandma in the barn. She hummed a tune while she sorted feed, and I thought maybe I had been imagining things after all. But, as the day ended and dusk began to settle, a low rumble in the distance caught my attention. It was coming from the direction of the cornfield. Grandma noticed too, pausing mid-task. Her eyes darted to the field, and a shadow flickered across her face. "It's the crows," she said, her voice unsteady. "They don't like it when he comes." I frowned, puzzled. "Who?" Grandma didn't answer, and I felt a chill spread through me. That night, I sat in the dark, the old house creaking as it settled. The tapping started again. And then, faintly, a low humming sound, like a twisted lullaby. I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sensation of something watching me. I turned my head, eyes adjusting to the faint light, and there it was, the figure from before, standing at the window. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Its hollow eyes met mine, and it moved. Fingers splayed against the glass as if it were trying to press through. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and threw it at the glass. The window shattered, and for a split second, the figure vanished. I ran to find Grandma. I found her at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't turn to look at me, and when I approached her, I noticed her hand was pressed tightly against the glass, leaving behind a print I couldn't understand. It wasn't the mark of a human hand. "It's here," she whispered, eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. "And he's coming back." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Not from the field, but from within the house. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't need to look. I knew I wouldn't like what I saw. It was an ordinary Saturday, and I decided to spend the day exploring the local flea market. It was sprawling and chaotic, filled with vendors selling everything from vintage clothing to antique furniture. I loved getting lost in the maze of tents and booths, weaving around people as I sifted through old trinkets and forgotten relics. Midway through the afternoon, I found myself drawn to a small, nondescript booth in the corner of the market. The man running it had an air of mystery, dressed in a tattered coat with eyes that flickered like candle flames whenever they caught the sunlight. The items on display were bizarre. Antique dolls with cracked porcelain faces, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, and small, delicate boxes with strange carvings. I was just about to leave when I spotted an old music box. It was ornately carved, with tiny dancers spinning in circles beneath a glass dome. I reached out, and as my fingers brushed it, the man's voice cut through the noise of the market. "Careful with that," he said, his tone sharp. "It's been known to attract attention." I froze, looking up at him. His smile was thin, almost predatory. "What kind of attention?" I asked, half joking. He leaned closer, eyes glinting with something unholy. "The kind you don't want." Before I could respond, a loud crash came from nearby, followed by the sound of panicked voices. I turned and saw a crowd gathering around a stall that had toppled over, scattering its contents across the pavement. My heart thudded with the sudden burst of chaos, and I shook my head, trying to ignore the man's words. I left the booth, music box still in hand, though it felt wrong, heavy in a way that didn't make sense. I wandered through the market, the noise and laughter suddenly grating on my nerves. The sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, and the air grew colder. Then, the music started. A soft, tinkling melody floated up from the music box I still held. It was a simple song, but it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I looked down at it, heart pounding, but the dancers remained frozen beneath the dome. The music should have stopped. The box wasn't wound up. I tried to put it down, but my fingers clamped tighter around it, as if someone else had control. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the market, stirring up paper cups and plastic bags. The voices of the crowd blurred into a low hum, as though muffled by a thick wall. And then I saw her, a girl in a faded, old-fashioned dress standing at the far end of the market. Her face was pale, with eyes like black holes that seemed to pierce right through me. She took a slow step forward, and the music box continued its haunting song. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, bumping into someone behind me. I whirled around, but the market was empty, save for me and the girl, who now stood only a few feet away. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that turned my breath to fog. I took another step back, but the girl's head tilted slightly, a cruel grin spreading across her face. A voice, thin and chilling, echoed inside my mind, "Play with me." The music box clattered to the pavement as I tried to run. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and my breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how hard I pushed, I couldn't move faster than the girl. Her eyes never left mine, and with every step, the air around us seemed to grow darker. I finally broke through the market and into the empty parking lot, where the late afternoon light was dim and dying. I couldn't see her anymore, but the song still played, winding through the parking lot like a thread pulling me back toward the chaos. I turned to grab the music box, but it was gone. I searched frantically, eyes darting over the cracked pavement. The song stopped suddenly, cutting off in a sharp note. Silence fell like a weight, and I swore I heard the faint sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the market was empty. The girl had vanished, and with her, the eerie melody that haunted me like a ghost. That was the last time I went back to that flea market, and the last time I ever heard a music box play. But I know it's still out there, waiting, because I can still hear the faint, haunting notes when the wind picks up at night. The park was beautiful that evening, with tall oaks and maple trees casting long, dappled shadows across the worn walking paths. It was a popular spot, nestled between the city and a sprawling riverbank, filled with joggers, families, and old couples who liked to feed the pigeons. I had been there countless times, but that day felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a strange, damp smell clung to the breeze. I was walking alone, headphones in, trying to shake off a bad mood that had settled over me all day. The path twisted through dense thickets, and the chatter of nearby park goers faded into the background. It was growing darker, and a chill seeped into my bones. I checked my watch just past 7 p.m. The sun had dipped behind the trees, painting the sky a bruised purple. I should have turned back, but I didn't want to go home, unless yet. Then I heard a soft whisper that seemed to brush against my ear. I yanked out my headphones and looked around. The park was still, empty save for a pair of joggers far off in the distance and the occasional flutter of wings from the trees. I told myself it was just the wind and kept walking, but the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. It was a voice, almost melodic, saying one word over and over, "Come." It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stopped, scanning the path behind me, but there was no one. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and took a shaky breath before continuing forward. The path narrowed and curved into a part of the park that I had never explored before. It was eerily quiet. No sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just that insistent voice, drawing me in. My heart pounded, but curiosity won out. I stepped off the path and into the underbrush, where brambles clawed at my jeans. The whisper led me deeper, away from the familiar trails. A clearing appeared, shrouded in shadows and framed by old stone statues of animals cracked and overrun with ivy. In the center stood an old fountain, water dry and choked with moss. But the most unsettling part was the girl. She was sitting on the edge of the fountain, her legs folded and her head bowed, as if lost in thought. Her hair was dark and unkempt, tangled with leaves and twigs. "Hey," I called hesitantly, my voice cracking in the silence. The girl didn't move, but I felt her gaze on me, even before she lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and vacant, too large for her face, rimmed with dark circles. And then she spoke. her voice so cold it made my blood freeze. "Not safe here," she whispered, but her lips didn't move. Before I could react, I heard the crunch of twigs behind me. Spinning around, I saw a figure emerge from the trees, a tall shadow with long, spindly limbs. The silhouette stepped forward, and the light of the moon caught its twisted smile. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. The girl stood up, her movements jerky, as if she were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. She looked at me, and in that instant, I knew she wasn't just warning me. She was trying to protect me. "Run," she mouthed, and the shadow lunged. I didn't think, I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main path. I gasped for air, looking back. The shadow had stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching me, but it didn't follow. The girl's silhouette stood behind it, her head cocked to one side as if waiting. The park lights flickered back to life, and the world around me settled into the comforting hum of the city. I turned and ran in the direction of the nearest street, every step echoing with the rush of my heart. When I finally reached the street, the voice whispered one last time, "Safe, but only for now." I didn't go back to that park, not ever. And now, every time I hear that whisper, a shiver runs through me. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for certain. There's something in that park that follows those who listen to the whispers. It was just another weekend trip. One of those spontaneous plans made when life started to feel suffocating. My friends and I decided to head out to a small, abandoned amusement park that had been closed for decades. It was the kind of place that was spoken about in hushed tones, a rumor passed around at bars and campfires, but none of us truly believed it was haunted. We were there for the thrill of the unknown, to see if we could convince ourselves the old legends were true. We arrived just before sunset, the fading orange light casting long, twisted shadows over resting rides and crumbling ticket booths. The entrance, a once vibrant arch with peeling paint, seemed to grin at us, daring us to step inside. With flashlights and a mixture of nervous excitement, we ventured in. The park was a maze of broken attractions, half missing clown faces on the Ferris wheel, an old carousel where the horses were now chipped and mottled with dirt. Everything was still, the air heavy with dust and the scent of decaying metal. The silence was so complete it felt like we were intruding on something sacred, something that shouldn't be disturbed. We explored for hours, jumping at every creak and groan as the wind swept through the twisted metal. By the time the last light dipped below the horizon, we were ready to head back. But as we walked toward the entrance, a loud, shrill laughter echoed from the direction of the FUNHOUSE. We all froze. The laughter was high-pitched and childlike, like it was coming from deep within the warped hallways of the broken building. My friend Mark snorted, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just the wind," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Let's check it out," Lizzie whispered, her eyes wide in the beam of her flashlight. None of us said no. Our curiosity got the better of us. The fun house was even worse up close. Its walls were warped, the windows shattered with jagged edges that looked like broken teeth. We pushed open the door, its rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was colder than outside, the scent of dampness and mold clinging to our noses. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight, and the walls seemed to lean in, closing us off from the rest of the world. We moved through the maze, the laughter growing louder, echoing from somewhere deeper within. We finally reached the center, where an old mirror maze stretched out in front of us, cracked and splintered like spiderwebs. In the dim light, we could see each other's reflections in a million broken pieces. The laughter stopped suddenly, and we all tensed, looking around. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. A shadow moved in one of the mirrors. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. But now, I noticed that one of the mirrors wasn't cracked, it was smooth, polished like a new surface. As I stepped closer, the cold feeling of dread spread through my chest. The mirror reflected my own face. But behind me, in the reflection, a dark figure stood just out of sight. My pulse quickened, my mouth going dry. The figure stepped forward, slowly, impossibly, and I stumbled back. Lizzie screamed, and Mark yelled, "Run!" But the entrance we had come through was gone. The walls of the funhouse seemed to have shifted, trapping us inside. The figure in the mirror moved, its shadowy limbs stretching out like they were reaching for me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, seeping into my bones. The mirror cracked, then shattered, and the laughter returned, louder, closer, as if dozens of people were in the maze with us. We bolted, not looking back, running through the maze of cracked glass and warped hallways until we stumbled outside. The night air was sharp with the scent of rust and cold, and the laughter still echoed in our ears. We didn't stop running until we were out of the park, looking back to see the lights of the funhouse flickering and going out, one by one. None of us spoke on the ride home. We didn't need to. We all knew that whatever we had seen was waiting for us in that mirror, something that wasn't just part of the broken funhouse, but something that had been trapped, lurking for years, waiting for someone to set it free. The moon was full, casting silver light across the desert as I drove along the empty road, the sound of gravel crunching under my tires. My friend Leo and I were heading to a remote, old roadside diner we'd heard about, a place that only opened once a year during the full moon. The legend said it was where lost travelers found their way, and we were adventurous enough to take that challenge. As we approached, I noticed the diner was nothing like I'd expected. It was an old, beat-up building with cracked glass windows and peeling paint. The neon sign that said Mabel's flickered sporadically, barely holding onto its promise of warm meals and forgotten stories. But we were here, and I wanted to see it through. Leo parked the car, and we stepped out, the chill of the desert night making my skin prickle. We pushed open the door, and the air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The place was dimly lit by oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows across the cracked tile floor. A jukebox sat in the corner, but it was silent. Feels like we're in a movie, Leo whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and unease. The only person inside was an elderly woman at the counter, her back turned as she adjusted a pot on the stove. Her hair was silver, and she wore a faded apron. She turned slowly, a smile spreading across her face as she took us in. "Welcome, travelers. You've come at just the right time," she said, her voice like gravel but warm. We exchanged nervous glances before taking a seat by the window. The waitress sat down to menus and left without saying a word, moving like a shadow. The stillness was broken when the door creaked open behind us. I turned and my breath caught in my throat. A man stepped inside, his skin pale as bone, eyes sunken and black. He didn't look at us. He walked straight to the booth at the far end of the diner, where he sat with a hunched posture. I looked away, shaking my head, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he was staring at me, eyes burning through my back. Leo's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "You see that guy? He doesn't look right." Before I could answer, the waitress returned, setting 2 plates of steaming food in front of us. "Eat up, boys. The night won't last long," she said, her eyes glancing at the man in the booth. I took a bite, trying not to think about the man. The food was warm, comfortingly spiced, but there was an underlying taste that I couldn't place, something metallic, almost bitter. Leo's eyes widened as he looked past me, and I turned to see the man at the booth standing up, moving toward us. He stopped beside our table, leaning down so his face was mere inches from mine. "Leave," he rasped. His voice was deeper than I expected, like it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. "Before it's too late." I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my mouth dry as I stared into those dark, hollow eyes. The waitress came over, her face pinched as if she were trying to keep something back. "Enough, Edward," she said, her voice low but firm. The man shrank back, glancing at her with a look of both fear and longing. Leo swallowed hard and pushed his chair back, knocking it over in his rush. I stood too, but as we made to leave, the room went dark. The lamps flickered and died, leaving us in an eerie, suffocating silence. Then, the jukebox clicked to life, playing a song I didn't recognize, a slow, mournful tune with a deep, almost mournful voice singing about betrayal and loss. And then the whispers started. First, they were faint, like the wind through the cracks, but they grew louder, insistent, filling the room. "Leave, it's not safe." The man Edward was now behind the counter, his head lowered, fingers pressing against his temples. The waitress stood between us and the door, blocking our escape. "You shouldn't have come," she said, the warmth in her voice replaced by something cold and sharp. Leo grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back door, the only exit that wasn't blocked. I barely managed to reach it when the whispers turned into a screech. The sound was so piercing it felt like my eardrums were about to burst. As we dashed outside into the moonlight, I glanced back one last time. The diner was now empty, the flickering neon sign blinking out. The whispers followed us into the desert night, and I knew we hadn't escaped. Not really. The next morning, when we returned to find the diner, there was no trace of it, just an empty stretch of desert, like it had never been there at all. And deep in my mind, I could still hear those whispers. The summer I was 15, my family decided to take a road trip to visit my grandparents' old farmhouse. It was nestled in the middle of the plains, surrounded by rolling fields of wheat and a cluster of pine trees that stood like sentinels in the distance. We had spent many weekends there, but this time felt different. The air carried a heaviness I couldn't explain, and the fields seemed to stretch out forever, almost to quiet. We arrived at dusk, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the house. My parents and younger brother were tired from the drive, so they unpacked the car while I wandered off to explore. I knew the farm well, every corner, every creaking step of the old porch, but tonight, as I walked past the tall grass, I noticed something strange. The wheat wasn't moving in the wind. It stood still, unmoving, like a sea of golden statues. I took a shaky breath and stepped closer. The silence was so profound it felt like it was pressing against my ears. I glanced back at the house, the warm glow of the porch light spilling out onto the yard, but no one was paying attention to me. The wind picked up suddenly, a gust so strong it made the hair on my arms stand on end. The fields rustled, a wave of sound moving through them like a whisper, but the sound was wrong. It was more like a low growl. I turned to run back to the house when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the pine trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. It had the shape of a person, but it was far too tall, and the way it stood, had tilted slightly as if listening, sent a chill through me. My legs froze, rooted to the spot as it took one slow step forward. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over a rock, and scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature did not move with the slow, natural steps of a person. It glided, as if its limbs were disconnected, an unsettling motion that made my stomach twist. "Hey, are you coming inside?" My brother's voice called from the porch. He stood there, eyes wide with curiosity. I opened my mouth to answer, but a deep, guttural sound interrupted me. It came from the figure, a low, churning noise that seemed to rumble up from its chest. The creature flinched, and in that moment, I saw its face. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were wide and too bright, like lanterns in the dark. A mouth split its face, cracked and full of jagged teeth, and it opened wide, releasing a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something raw and primal. "Get inside," I shouted, tearing my eyes away from it and running back to the house. My brother's eyes went wide with shock as he followed, but when we slammed the door shut, the noise outside stopped. For a second, all was silent. Then there was a knock on the window, sharp and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. We huddled together, listening to the silence that had returned, broken only by our heavy breaths. My father came running into the room, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" "It was out there," I said, my voice shaking. I wanted to tell him about the figure, the eyes, the sound, but before I could, we all heard it, the same low growl, but closer this time. The window rattled as if something was pressing against it, something unseen, but unmistakably there. We were trapped in that house until dawn. When the first rays of sunlight touched the fields, the knocking stopped, and we found ourselves alone again. The wheat swayed in the breeze, as if nothing had happened at all. But every year after that, when summer came and the fields were golden, I couldn't help but wonder, did it ever really leave? And if it did, where did it go? I was never a fan of the old, abandoned amusement park on the edge of town. It was more of an eyesore than anything, a relic from a better time, rusted and decaying. But on that day, with the sun low and the air heavy with the smell of rain, my friends convinced me to go. We wanted something different for once, And what better way to kick off the summer than exploring somewhere creepy? We made our way through the overgrown paths and cracked pavement, the chirping of cicadas growing louder as the sky darkened. The entrance was flanked by two massive stone lions with chipped noses and vacant eyes. We pushed open the wrought iron gate, the hinges protesting with a screech that echoed in the silence. The place was a maze of forgotten rides. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like a skeletal giant, its seat swaying in the breeze. A bumper car track sat to the left, rusted vehicles tilted at odd angles. We wandered further in, laughing and daring each other to go deeper. It was around the fun house when I noticed the first strange thing. A soft, metallic thud came from behind us, like someone had dropped a heavy tool. We all turned, but the path was empty, probably just a raccoon, Lisa said, brushing her hair behind her ear. But I felt it then, a presence, a tingle that ran from the back of my neck to my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I glanced at my friends, but they were too busy poking fun at each other to notice. We pressed on, past a derelict clown stage where torn posters flapped like restless ghosts. The wind picked up, swirling around us and making the plastic banners snap like whips. Then, without warning, we heard a low, groaning hum that seemed to come from deep within the ground. "What was that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us shuddered. I stumbled, grabbing for the nearest rail. The whole park seemed to shift, as if a giant had taken a deep breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. But they didn't hear me. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the Ferris wheel. I turned to see what they were looking at and my blood froze. The wheel had moved. Just a fraction, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. One of the seats, a rusty bucket on the edge, creaked forward and backward like it was testing the air. And then, a child's giggle rang out. It was high-pitched and sweet, but it wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to my friends. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing Mark by the arm, but he didn't move. He was staring at the clown stage where a small, shadowy figure stood. It had the shape of a child, but its limbs were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Another giggle, closer this time. I pulled Mark again, but he yanked his arm free and stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The figure on the stage came to life. It moved with the jerky, stuttering motion of a marionette, limbs twitching in a dance that felt both mechanical and alive. It was dressed in a faded clown suit, with patches that looked like they had been stitched with coarse, black thread. Its face was painted in a grotesque grin, eyes hollow and unblinking. "Get out," I screamed, grabbing Lisa and dragging her toward the exit. We ran past the bumper cars, the wind roaring behind us as the distant sound of a carnival organ started up, playing a broken, discordant tune. As we reached the gate, the childish giggle cut through the air again, louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder one last time and saw a pale hand, fingers too long and tipped with dark nails, reaching out from the edge of the Ferris wheel seat. The night air felt sharp as we bolted through the gate, the iron bars clanging shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were far from the park, the sounds of the organ still ringing in our ears. None of us spoke on the way home. When we looked at each other, we knew we had seen a glimpse of something that shouldn't be. A reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold echoes of things that should have been forgotten. And the park, with its twisted laughter and stilled rides, was far from abandoned. It was waiting. The evening had been perfect, a last-minute road trip with friends, chasing the sunset along an old, winding highway that cut through rolling fields and endless orchards. We pulled off the road just as night began to fall, seeking the perfect place to stargaze. The clearing we found was surrounded by towering oaks and the scent of wildflowers, and we stretched out on blankets with our heads tilted up, drinking in the crisp air and the glittering night sky. That's when we heard the faint sound of music. It was soft at first, barely louder than the rustle of the wind. But, as we lay there, eyes wide with curiosity, it grew clearer. It was an old song, one with an ancient, mournful melody, like something out of an old folk tale. My friends exchanged puzzled glances, half-heartedly laughing it off as the wind-carrying sound from a distant festival or event. But when we stood up and looked around, there was nothing. Just trees, dark and still, I felt a chill slide down my back. Something about the way the music sounded so close but impossible to trace made my skin prickle. I turned to Sam, who was always the most skeptical of us, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than our imaginations. "Do you hear that?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sam squinted into the dark. "Yeah, but it's probably just some old radio or something. Let's not make a big deal out of it." But when we looked down the dirt path leading to the clearing, we noticed the shadows seemed to shift. The song grew louder, moving from the murmur of a lullaby to a deep, harmonious hum that sent a wave of discomfort through me. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had stilled, and the world felt locked in place, holding its breath. I glanced at the others, who were now starting to look uneasy. Just as we were about to pack up and head back to the car, the song stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, a different sound reached our ears, a low, metallic scraping, like nails on a sheet of metal. I froze. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling. Something in the air had shifted, as though we were no longer alone. "Let's go," Sam said, voice trembling. We grabbed our things, half running back the way we came, the hairs on my arms standing on end. We reached the car, our laughter strained and nervous as we tried to convince each other that nothing was wrong. We pulled out, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. But, as we passed the edge of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught my breath. A figure stood at the edge of the path, half shrouded in shadows. Its silhouette was humanoid but distorted, as if it had been carved out of the night itself. Its head tilted in our direction, and for a moment, I thought I saw its mouth curve into something that almost resembled a smile. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The figure disappeared from sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, following. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees whispering secrets as we sped past them, the sense of being pursued growing stronger. When we finally reached town, the streetlights felt like a promise of safety. We stopped at a diner and tried to calm down, sipping on cheap coffee that did nothing to chase away the fear. It was only when we looked out the window at the dark stretch of road behind us that we saw it again, just for a second. The figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. The waitress at the counter glanced at us, her eyes shadowed with a knowing look. "You're not the first to see him," she said softly. "They say he comes when the music plays." We left before dawn, but I knew I would never forget the look in that creature's eyes. It was as though it had been waiting for us, and now, I was certain that it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting for the next song to begin. The summer I spent helping my uncle on his farm is one I'll never forget. He ran the place solo, the land stretching for miles under an ever-cloudy sky. I loved the open fields and the cool breeze that seemed to carry whispers through the tall corn. The farm was remote, with no neighbors for miles. I thought I knew every sound and shadow that came with it, but I was wrong. It started as a normal evening. The golden light dipped behind the hills as I finished up the chores, sweeping hay and feeding the goats. My uncle was already in the house, his shadow long across the barn floor as he called out for dinner. I turned to lock up the barn, the rusted hinges creaking like an old man's bones. That's when I heard a deep, guttural noise coming from the woods beyond the edge of the farm. I squinted through the twilight, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the coyotes, their howls were sharper, more playful. This was low, slow, like the rumble of a distant, dying engine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind in the trees. The next evening, I heard it again. This time, the noise was closer, resonating in my bones like a warning. I had just finished milking the cows when the rumble came, followed by a faint dragging sound. It was as if something heavy was being dragged through the underbrush. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just some stray animal. My uncle, old and unyielding, noticed my hesitation when I came inside. "You hear that, boy?" he asked, eyes sharp under the dim lamplight. He didn't wait for me to respond. "Stay inside after dark. You don't know what's out there." That night, sleep came hard. Every time I dozed off, the dragging noise jolted me awake. The sounds of footsteps, rough and uneven, scraping along the wooden floor outside the bedroom window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I dared not move. I could almost hear it breathing, something wet and rasping, like the air after a storm. The next day, I asked my uncle if he'd heard the sounds, but he just gave me a hard look. "I've lived here my whole life," he said, leaning over the kitchen table. "I've never heard anything like that before." That evening, the noise was louder than ever. It was as if something had been waiting for me to notice it, biding its time. I crept outside, armed with only a lantern and a rusty pitchfork. The air was thick and still, too quiet for comfort. I shivered, the skin on my arms crawling as I moved toward the trees. I saw then a figure that didn't belong. A man, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs bent like branches, his face hidden in shadow. He stood motionless, just beyond the line of trees, staring at me with eyes that reflected the lantern's light like twin, bottomless pools. The ground shifted, and I realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, the earth moved as if breathing, the grass parting to reveal shapes that writhed in the dark. My legs froze in place, and I could only watch as the figures emerged, eyes wide, mouths agape, hands reaching out like they wanted to pull me in. The dragging noise roared louder, almost deafening, as one of the figures lunged toward me, its face illuminated just enough to see that it had none. A yawning hollow, the size of a fist, where its features should have been. I screamed and ran back to the house, stumbling and nearly tripping over the roots of an ancient oak. I didn't stop until I slammed the front door shut, the lock clicking into place behind me. My uncle came running, but the sounds had faded. He looked at me, concern in his eyes, but he said nothing. We sat in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling it press down on us. That night, as dawn approached, the noise came back, a low thrum like the heartbeat of the earth. But it was different this time, quieter, almost like it was satisfied. I never saw them again, but I heard them whenever I went out to the barn, a low drag and an echo that whispered, "We're waiting." And now, I know what my uncle meant when he said, "You don't know what's out there." Because whatever it was, it knew me, and it wasn't done yet. It was just supposed to be a routine trip, a day out in the countryside to pick apples with my younger sister. We had heard about an orchard outside town that had been around for decades, with the kind of reputation that promised perfect fruit and peaceful afternoons. The kind of place where time slowed down, where you could forget everything for a few hours. We arrived early in the morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The orchard was beautiful, sprawling with apple trees so old they seemed to hold secrets in their gnarled branches. A single, weathered sign hung at the entrance, reading "Harvest time, take only what you can carry." It sounded simple enough, but something in its tone made me pause. The first few hours were idyllic. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light that danced across the ground. My sister laughed as she climbed higher to reach the ripest apples, her voice bright and carefree. I stood below, picking out the juiciest fruits and filling our basket. But then the humming started. It was faint at first, like a distant melody, but it grew louder as I glanced around. The orchard was silent save for the wind rustling the leaves, but the hum was unmistakable. I looked up at my sister, who had stopped moving and was looking over her shoulder, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. The humming was like a song, but with no words. It had an unnatural quality, a sweetness that was almost painful to listen to. I stepped closer to her, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Suddenly, a branch behind us snapped. We both jumped, looking around as the air grew colder. The trees that once seemed so inviting now felt like they were leaning in, like they were eavesdropping on our fear. My sister, still half in the tree, climbed down quickly, her eyes darting around. "Let's get out of here," I said, but she didn't move. She was staring at something beyond the rows of trees, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, but before she could answer, the humming broke into a distinct voice, low and melodic. It didn't sound like any human voice I had ever heard. "I see you." The words didn't come from anywhere we could see. It was as if they were carried on the wind, but they were close, right behind us. I grabbed my sister's hand and pulled her toward the path leading out of the orchard, but the air seemed heavier now, pressing against us as though the forest didn't want us to leave. The trees on either side of us seemed to move, the branches twisting to create a corridor that funneled us deeper into the orchard. I heard a branch snap behind us, and I turned to see a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, to tall, and its shape was shifting, flickering like a broken video. It had eyes that glowed, hollow, with an intensity that made my blood run cold. We ran faster, my sister stumbling as I pulled her along. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following, like the breath of something cold and unseen at our backs. When we finally burst out of the orchard and into the open fields, the sun was higher in the sky, and everything seemed normal again. The humming stopped, the oppressive feeling vanished, and the air felt warm as if nothing had happened. But, as we looked back, the orchard was empty, the trees still and unmoving. And then, just as I thought we were safe, I heard the voice again, this time from the edge of the woods. "I see you." My sister grabbed my arm, eyes wide with terror. The air was still, but in the silence, I could almost hear the trees whispering, shifting, preparing for the next time we dared to enter. It was supposed to be a peaceful day at the beach. I had planned to spend the day with my younger brother, Liam, just the two of us. Our parents had taken off for the weekend, and with school out for the summer, it felt like the perfect time to enjoy some sun and salt water. We loaded up the old beach wagon with towels, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks and headed to the secluded cove that I discovered years ago, a place far from the crowded main beach. The sun was high in the sky, casting everything in brilliant gold. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks was soothing, and the distant cries of seagulls were a familiar soundtrack. We set up our spot close to the water, building a small fort of beach towels and umbrellas. I splashed around in the surf while Liam played in the sand, building his usual sand castles that were more fortresses than anything else around mid-afternoon. I noticed a shift in the air. The breeze had picked up, and the temperature dropped slightly. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause. I glanced at Liam, who was now sitting on a pile of seashells, staring out at the horizon with an odd expression on his face. "Hey, you okay?" I called, waving to get his attention. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were wide and unfocused, like he was seeing something far away. "Liam," I said again, walking up to him. He stood up, his face pale. "There's someone out there," he whispered, pointing out to the water. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing unusual, just the endless stretch of sea and sky. "Liam, there's no one there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was a tremble in it. He shook his head, refusing to look away. The wind picked up, the waves slapping against the shore more urgently now, as if the ocean itself was trying to warn us. Just then, I heard a sound, a low, guttural groan that came from the direction of the cove's rocky outcrop. I glanced toward it, but the rocks were empty. The sound grew louder, closer, like something was coming up from the depths. I grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him away from the water as a sudden wave crashed onto the shore, spraying us with cold salt water. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight with fear. As we gathered our things, I caught sight of something moving out of the corner of my eye, dark figures, shapes in the water that seemed to shift and flow like ink. They were watching us, and then they were moving toward us, gliding through the water without making a sound. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pulled Liam up the beach, our feet sinking into the warm sand as we ran. But when I looked back, I saw them more clearly now, figures, pale and ragged, with limbs that twisted at impossible angles. Their eyes, dark and hollow, followed us as we fled. We stumbled up the path that led to the main road, the sand scraping at our bare feet. The distant roar of the waves and the groaning from the cove behind us faded, replaced by the heavy thumping of our breaths. Once we reached the car, I fumbled for the keys, almost dropping them as my hands shook. "Are they following us?" Liam gasped, looking back down the dirt road, but there was nothing, just the empty path leading back to the cove. I turned the car on and sped away, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What were those things? Why did they come to the shore, to the place where we were? And why did Liam see them before I did? The rest of the day passed in a blur, and I never told anyone what had happened. But every now and then, when I close my eyes at night, I hear that low groan coming from the direction of the ocean, and I remember the eyes in the water, waiting. There's something unnerving about the woods at night, especially when you aren't supposed to be there. I didn't believe the stories, none of us did. My friends and I were spending a weekend at an old countryside house, the kind with creaky floors and endless fields stretching toward the tree line. It was remote, quiet, and perfect for hiking during the day. But when night fell, the woods took on a life of their own. On the second evening, after dinner, we decided to test a local legend we'd heard from one of the neighbors. The story went that deep in the forest, hidden in an overgrown clearing, was a ring of stones older than anyone could remember. They said the stones moved if you stared at them too long, shifting like shadows when you weren't looking. But the most important part of the story was this: never stay in the ring after midnight. We laughed about it, of course. It sounded ridiculous, like something cooked up to keep kids from wandering too far. So, armed with flashlights and a couple of beers, we headed into the woods to find the clearing. The moon was bright enough to guide us partway, its pale light cutting through the skeletal branches above. Everything else was silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind. It was like the woods were holding their breath. After about an hour of walking, we found it. The clearing was small, just a patch of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. In the center stood the stones, a rough circle no taller than my waist. They were worn smooth by time, moss clinging to their sides like green veins. There was something unsettling about the way they were arranged, almost a perfect, like they had been placed there by someone, or something, with intent. We joked about summoning ancient spirits and dared each other to step inside. Eventually, I caved and walked into the center of the ring, spinning around with mock solemnity. My friends clapped and laughed, their voices echoing strangely in the still air. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then the temperature dropped. I thought I imagined it at first, but my breath started to fog in front of me, and I saw my friends shiver. One of them asked if we should head back, but I waved them off, trying to lighten the mood. That's when the first stone moved. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight shift, like it had nudged itself an inch to the left. I laughed nervously, assuming it was a trick of the light. But then another stone shifted, sliding so silently it was almost imperceptible. My heart skipped a beat as I looked to my friends for reassurance, but their faces told me they'd seen it too. We stood frozen, our flashlights bouncing off the stones as they began to shift, one by one, closing the circle tighter around me. My legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand, and I couldn't force myself to move. One of my friends shouted at me to get out of the ring, but I couldn't hear them over the pounding in my ears. The stones stopped moving. The circle was smaller now, just barely wide enough for me to stand in. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Words I couldn't understand swirled around me, growing louder with each second. My friends were yelling at me to run, but the whispers drowned them out. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I don't know what made me snap out of it. Maybe it was the fear in my friend's voice, or the sudden realization that the stones were closing in again. I stumbled forward, tripping over my own feet as I hurled myself out of the ring. The moment I crossed the boundary, the whispers stopped. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, crashing through the underbrush until we burst out of the woods and into the field. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't look back. The next morning, we returned to the clearing, convinced we had imagined the whole thing. But when we got there, the stones were gone. In their place was a single, freshly dug hole. Whatever we disturbed that night, it didn't want us coming back. I've always worked late shifts at the old city library. The building is massive, a maze of bookshelves and reading nooks, half lit and musty. I loved it. It was quiet, save for the sound of the pages turning and the occasional hiss of the old, creaky radiator. But it wasn't until the winter storm hit that I discovered how easily something could hide within the shadows. That night, I was the only one there. The wind whistled through the cracked panes of glass, and the lights flickered sporadically. I pushed the thought of getting stuck inside the library out of my mind. I had a shift to finish. The snow piled up against the doors like an impenetrable wall, and I couldn't hear the city at all anymore. It felt like the whole world had gone silent. I stood up from the desk and stretched, looking over the vast sea of books. I made my way down the aisle of history, past the stacks of dusty volumes and the occasional antique globe. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. Just rows upon rows of books, their spines blanketed in darkness. I pushed it aside and continued. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped by the reference section, leaning against the oak desk. I swiped my phone out of habit. No signal. Of course. The library was a black hole for reception. The sudden jolt of the lights cutting out made me jump. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath at the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes searching for a source of the chill. The emergency lights came on, casting a blood-orange glow that made the old, dusty books appear as if they were bleeding. I shivered and tried to steady my breathing, but something didn't feel right. The silence returned, deeper and more suffocating. I swallowed hard, daring to move toward the staff room to check the circuit box. I was halfway across the room when I heard a sharp, wet slap behind me. I spun around, eyes going wide as they locked onto the source, a book, lying open on the floor, its pages moving as if stirred by some invisible hand. The pages whispered, the sound more like a breathing than a breeze. I crept closer, the soft crackling of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The book was open to a page I didn't recognize, a drawing in the margin of a hollow-eyed face with a grotesque grin. The lines seemed to shift as I stared. The eyes blinked, then looked straight at me. The distant creak of a chair moving in the staff room pulled my attention. I took a shaky breath, clutching the book to my chest, and turned to find the door ajar, a deep, unnatural shadow spilling out into the hallway. The scent of damp earth and something rotting reached me as I inched forward. I didn't remember leaving it open. The room was empty, but I noticed the far window, cracked and icy, was now wide open. The wind howled, pulling the pages of nearby books like they were alive. And then I heard a sound like a quiet giggle, sharp and full of malice. My pulse quickened, my skin crawling in the dim light. I noticed it, a figure just inside the dark, its head too large for its shoulders, grinning wide, eyes empty but fixed on me. I backed up, the book slipping from my hands as I stumbled over my feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then it lunged. The next moment was a blur. I was out of the library and into the biting wind, not daring to look back, the giggle still ringing in my ears. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached the street, the library's lights were out, completely dark. No more orange glow, no more whispers, just the cold and the oppressive silence. The next day, when I went back to retrieve my things, the library was exactly as I had left it, the book lying open on the floor, the page with the face now blank. They never believed me. The others said I was just tired, imagining things. But every time I passed the library, I glanced at the window where I saw it watching me. And I swear it's still there, waiting. We were a group of 5 friends, all of us desperate for a break from the chaos of everyday life. So, we rented a remote cabin tucked deep in the woods for a weekend of solitude. No phones, no distractions, just us, the trees, and the stars. It seemed perfect. The cabin was old, but charming, with wooden floors that creaked under our feet and a fireplace that crackled warmly in the living room. The first evening passed in a blur of laughter and drinks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill settled over the woods, and the wind began to pick up. It rattled the windows and howled through the trees like a warning, but no one took it seriously. We were having too much fun. That night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. The air in the room felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. At first, I chalked it up to the late hour, but then I heard it soft tapping at the window. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart began to race. I lay still, holding my breath, hoping it would stop. The tapping continued. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. I could barely make out the trees outside, their outlines swaying in the dim moonlight. Then I saw a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. It was tall, too tall, its face hidden in shadow. It stood perfectly still. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Was it a person, or something worse? The tapping grew louder, more frantic, like a desperate plea. I didn't want to wake the others, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bird or a branch, but I knew deep down at WAS and single quotes T. Eventually, the tapping stopped, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then hours, and just when I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, a knock came at the door. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I froze. The others were deep asleep. I couldn't bring myself to go to them. I could only lie there, listening, praying it would stop. The knock came again, and this time I heard a voice. It was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent ice through my veins. Let me in. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone, but I couldn't move. I didn't even want to look at the door. The voice came again, more urgent this time. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I gripped the covers, my knuckles white, waiting for something to happen, but then, as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The woods fell silent again. I didn't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, unable to move. The silence pressed in on me like a heavy weight. At dawn, I crept out of bed, careful not to wake the others. The house was still and quiet. I stood by the door, staring at the handle, half expecting it to turn on its own. But nothing happened. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I opened it, but I did. I stepped into the hallway, and everything seemed normal. The house was unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me. Something not human. When we gathered in the kitchen later, I told my friends what had happened. They all laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. But then Sarah, one of the girls in our group, spoke up. Her voice was trembling as she described hearing soft whispers coming from the woods the previous night. A voice that wasn't hers. None of us had heard anything like that before. We all thought it was just a coincidence, but we couldn't shake the unease that lingered over the rest of the day. That evening, we decided to leave early. The air felt wrong, thick with an unspoken tension. As we packed the car, I happened to glance at the door again. The same one I had heard the knocking at. To my horror, the doorknob was now covered in fresh scratches, deep gouges, as though something or someone had been clawing at it from the other side. We didn't stay another minute. As we drove away, I tried to rationalize it. But I knew deep down that something had been in that cabin with us. Something that wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't until later, when I looked through the photos from the trip, that I found the final, chilling detail. In one of the pictures we had taken of the cabin from the front yard, there was a figure standing just behind the window. Barely visible, it was the same tall figure I had seen outside the night before, its face still hidden in shadow. And in that moment, I realized the truth. We had never been alone in that cabin. It had been watching us the entire time. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm-worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard it a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. We never planned on staying at the old inn. It was a last-minute decision, one of those spontaneous trips where you just pick a place and go. My friends and I had rented a cabin a few hours away from the city, hoping for a weekend of peace and fun. When we arrived, though, the place felt wrong. There was something about it like a faint, suffocating presence in the air that made my skin prickle. The inn looked fine at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. We checked in with the manager, a pale woman with hollow eyes who barely looked up from her desk. She handed us a key and muttered something about the inn being under renovation, but her words barely registered. It wasn't until we reached our room that the unease settled in. The door groaned as we opened it, revealing an oddly furnished space with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered by heavy curtains. It felt like time had stopped there. The air was stifling, thick with something that made me uneasy. That night, we decided to explore the inn. It was late, but curiosity got the best of us. We wandered through the long hallways, the wooden floorboards echoing under our footsteps. The place was eerily quiet, no sounds of other guests, no laughter, no voices, just silence, broken by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then, we heard it. A soft, slow tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, this time closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. We reached a door at the end of the hall, one that looked different from the others. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it all the way. We pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, but there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall, one of those large, full-length ones. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I felt a chill run through me, and my friends laughed, thinking it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away quickly, but the tapping sound came again, this time much louder, right outside the door. It was fast now, frantic, like something was desperate to get in. We all rushed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The hall was empty, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt colder, the silence heavier. We walked back toward our room, the tapping following us, echoing down the corridor. My heart raced as we reached our door. The key wouldn't fit into the lock, no matter how many times I tried. It was as if the door itself didn't want us inside. Finally, I pushed the door open with force, and we rushed inside, locking it behind us. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, whispering voice. It was too faint to understand, but it was there scraping at the edges of my mind. I sat on the bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, just a product of the late hour and a creepy atmosphere. But then the room grew unnaturally cold. I looked at the mirror across from me. The reflection was different now. It wasn't me standing there, it was someone else. A figure in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but their eyes were glowing, watching me. The tapping stopped. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Let me out," it whispered. I jumped back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the door to our room creaked open, slowly, on its own. I rushed to shut it, but the door didn't move. It was stuck, like something was holding it from the other side. In the reflection, I saw the figure step toward the door. And then it spoke again, louder now, as if it was right beside me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to my friends, but they were all staring at the mirror, wide-eyed, as though they were seeing the same thing I was. That's when I understood. The inn wasn't just old, it was a trap. The figure, the whispers, the tapping, it was all part of it. Something wanted us to stay, to never leave. We packed up and left the next morning, the sun barely rising, the inn still silent. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Just empty space, surrounded by trees. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that inn didn't want us to leave. And it might be waiting for the next people who wander too close. It started as a quiet night, the kind where you feel the weight of the silence pressing against your ears. I was dog-sitting for a friend at their house in the countryside. They had warned me it could get lonely out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and open fields, but I had shrugged it off. I enjoyed solitude, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was wrong. The house was small, cozy, with large windows that overlooked the woods. The dog, a large shepherd mix, had been restless all evening, pacing near the back door. I figured he just missed his owners. The night stretched on uneventfully. I fed him, let him out into the yard for a while, and finally settled on the couch to watch some TV. Around 11, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like something wrestling against the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened, but everything had gone silent. I chalked it up to the wind. Living in the city had dulled my sense of how noisy the countryside could be. The dog, however, didn't seem convinced. He stood in the middle of the room, ears pricked, staring at the back door. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. I called him over, and he reluctantly lay at my feet. I tried to focus on the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt colder, as if the warmth had seeped out through invisible cracks. At midnight, the sound came again. This time, it was louder. It wasn't just rustling. It was a deliberate, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked to the back door. The dog followed, his fur bristling. I flipped on the porch light. The yard was empty, the woods beyond it still and dark. The sound had stopped. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside to get a better look. The cold air stung my skin as I peered into the shadows. That was when the dog began to growl. A low, guttural sound that I had never heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the yard, where the light didn't quite reach. I followed his gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, misshapen figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just a shadow. But the dog's growl deepened, and his body tensed as if ready to pounce. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. The dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. I tried to calm myself. I told myself there was nothing out there, that my imagination was running wild. But the unease didn't leave me. I decided to stay awake, just in case. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The dog had settled at my feet again, but his ears twitched at every creak and groan of the house. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft but insistent, coming from the back door. The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. My heart raced as I got up and crept toward the door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. I glanced through the window but saw nothing. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then the knocking stopped. A moment of silence followed, then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar. It was my own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The dog began barking furiously. His body pressed against the door as if trying to protect me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled, and the dog's barking grew frantic. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The yard was empty. The voice stopped, and so did the dog. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to look for any signs of what had happened. There were no footprints, no disturbed soil, nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the door. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were the words I had heard all night. "Let me in." The dog refused to go near the door for the rest of the day. Neither of us ever stayed in that house again. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said. My voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heart beat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone." It started on a late autumn night when a friend and I decided to explore an abandoned house just outside of town. It had been empty for decades, the kind of place that fueled urban legends. People whispered about lights flickering in the windows and strange noises coming from inside. Naturally, we were curious, the way only young people, with nothing better to do, could be. The house was enormous, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were broken, and the front door hung on rusted hinges. We had brought flashlights, but I remember the beams barely cutting through the dense darkness inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. Leaves crunched underfoot as we stepped onto the warped floorboards. The entryway opened into a cavernous living room. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the gloom. A grand staircase loomed to the left, its banister coated in cobwebs. We agreed to start upstairs, feeling braver together. The steps groaned beneath our weight, each creak reverberating through the empty house. As we reached the landing, I noticed the unsettling silence. No wind, no animal sounds. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The first few rooms were empty, just peeling wallpaper and broken glass. But the third door was different. It was shut tight, unlike the others that swung open with ease. I felt a strange resistance when I turned the knob, as if something was pressing back from the other side. My friend joked that it was probably swollen from the damp, but I could see he was uneasy too. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a small bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a child's bed frame sat against one wall. But what drew my attention was the dresser. Its mirror was intact, unlike the broken shards scattered throughout the house. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection, the room wasn't empty. There was a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the corner, but there was no one there. I glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. My friend had seen it too. He was pale, his flashlight shaking slightly. Neither of us said a word, but we backed out of the room. Shutting the door firmly behind us, we decided to leave, suddenly feeling like we had overstayed our welcome. As we descended the staircase, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. Just as we reached the front door, we heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide. Against my better judgment, I suggested we check it out. I didn't want to be the person who ignored something like that, only to regret it later. We crept back up the stairs, every creak of the wood amplifying the tension. The crash had come from the same bedroom. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we found the room exactly as we had left it except for the mirror. It was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. The frame was twisted, almost as if it had been torn apart by something stronger than human hands. I knelt to pick up a shard, curiosity overriding fear. That was when I noticed something chilling. The pieces of glass reflected not just us, but the entire room except for the space behind us. It was blank, a void where the rest of the room should have been. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my breathing ragged. That was when we heard the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A single word, drawn out and raspy. Leave. It didn't sound like a plea or a warning. It sounded like a command. My friend didn't wait. He bolted down the stairs, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The house stood silent and still, its dark windows staring back at us. But, as we turned to leave, I saw something in the upper window. A shadow. Unmoving. Watching us. We drove back to town in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what had happened. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something chilling. The mirror in my bedroom, which I had owned for years, had a crack running through it. And in that crack, faintly, I could see the outline of a figure. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name. Let me in. I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time. Let me in. The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure, just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. Let me in. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed that the mirror dot it was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. I never thought much about haunted houses or strange occurrences. I was always the one to brush off stories, but everything changed during a trip with some friends a few years ago. We decided to rent a secluded cabin for the weekend, far away from any city lights or distractions. It seemed like the perfect escape, peaceful, quiet, surrounded by trees. The first night was fine. We settled in, made dinner, and started telling ghost stories by the fire. I wasn't scared until we heard something strange around midnight. After we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. It was a rhythmic, slow tapping, like someone knocking. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a little louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up to check, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, tapping, soft and persistent. Then, a voice, a faint whisper. It said my name, Sarah. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but it was empty, still. The whispering stopped as soon as I looked out the window, but I felt something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. When morning came, I didn't tell anyone. They'd all laugh at me, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But that evening, as we sat around the fire, one of my friends, Jake, casually mentioned hearing the same tapping the night before. Then, Emma spoke up. She'd heard the whispering too, only she thought it was just a dream. We all went silent. Maybe it's an animal, Mark said, trying to ease the tension. But we were all on edge now, aware of the strange sounds that had plagued us. Later that night, I decided to check the window again. Maybe I could convince myself it was just the wind or something. As I walked to the window, I felt a cold draft sweep across my skin. I pulled the curtain back, but the tapping was there again, like it was coming from just beyond the glass. I gasped, backing away, my mind racing. Then, I noticed something else. There was a shadow moving outside. It was too dark to make out details, but it wasn't the shape of a person, it was too fluid, like it was slithering, creeping around the cabin. I rushed to wake the others. We stood in the living room, staring out the windows, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shadow moved in circles around the cabin, and then it stopped right at the front door. There was no knock, just an intense silence that filled the space. We waited, holding our breath. And then, the door creaked open on its own, slowly, as if someone or something had entered. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't supposed to open like that. We rushed to the door, and as we stepped outside, we saw what had been circling the cabin. Footprints. Large, uneven prints, leading toward the woods. Something had been out there, watching us, moving around the cabin. But what terrified me most wasn't the footprints, it was the set of prints that led right back to the door. Whoever, or whatever it was, had been right inside with us, watching, waiting. We didn't stay the next night. We packed up quickly and left, too frightened to even consider staying any longer. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure: something was in that cabin with us. Something that moved without a sound, waited without a breath, and followed us back home. The question still lingers in my mind: is it still waiting? The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect and unwind. My friends and I were overdue for a weekend getaway. So, when we found a secluded cabin in the woods, we jumped at the opportunity. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for: old, rustic, and off the beaten path. There was something charming about the creaky floors and the smell of pine in the air. We gathered around the fireplace, laughing and reminiscing, settling in for what promised to be a peaceful weekend. But that first night, something felt off. As the fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a strange rhythm. It wasn't the kind of wind that howls, it was like something was tapping on the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just branches brushing against the wood. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on the front door. I glanced at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. The knocking had a deliberate, almost human quality to it. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. So I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the wind outside, howling against the trees. I slowly backed away, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The night passed in a strange haze. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, hearing the occasional knock on the door and the unsettling scraping sound. But when I checked again, no one was outside. The cabin was still. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and we were all exhausted. But when we stepped outside to explore the woods, I noticed something strange: footprints in the snow leading toward the cabin, fresh and deep. They weren't from any of us. They circled the cabin before fading into the trees. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt too quiet, like the trees were watching us, waiting. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors. But that night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just beyond the window. I quietly got up, careful not to wake the others, and peeked outside. Nothing, just the snow-covered ground and the trees, swaying in the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It didn't seem to belong to anything. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette stretching across the snow. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but when I blinked, it was gone. I bolted back to my bed, my heart racing. I lay there, wide awake, listening, and then I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was ragged, almost distorted. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed still, too terrified to move, listening as the knocking came again, louder this time, right against the door. It didn't stop. Not until morning. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They thought I was just spooked, maybe imagining things, but they agreed to leave early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something else. The footprints from the day before weren't just around the cabin, they were leading toward the woods, and they were fresh, but they didn't look like human footprints. They were too large, too deep, and there was something wrong about them. They circled around the cabin, but then, right by the door, there were more marks. Scratches, gouges in the wood, like something had been clawing at it from the outside. We didn't wait around to investigate. We left, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, the wind completely absent. We never went back, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that wanted in. What I didn't realize until later was that the knocking wasn't the scariest part. It was the voice, the one that whispered, "Let me in." Because when I went back through the photos we took that weekend, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, just outside the window, there's a figure standing in the trees, and it's smiling. I've always been a night owl, often working into the early hours of the morning. That particular night, I had an assignment due for work, so I decided to stay late in the office. I wasn't the only one. A few others were around, but it was mostly quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft clicking of keyboards around to AM. The office began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could immediately put my finger on, just an unsettling sense that something wasn't right. The building was old, and sometimes the pipes would creak or the air conditioning would kick on with a groan. But this felt different. It felt like someone was in the building with me. I shook it off. I was just tired. The only other person in the office was Carol, who worked across the room from me. She was hunched over her desk, working on some spreadsheets, her glasses reflecting the light of her screen. I figured if something was wrong, she would notice too, but she seemed perfectly absorbed in her work. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a short break. I stood up, stretched, and headed to the break room to grab some water. As I passed the row of cubicles, I noticed that the hallway lights flickered, but I didn't think much of it. I've seen lights go out before in this building. When I walked into the break room, the door clicked shut behind me, but when I turned around to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. I tugged at it, confused. It wasn't stuck. It just wouldn't budge. I could hear Carol's muffled voice from the other side, talking to someone. But why would she be talking to someone this late? I hadn't seen anyone else around. I pounded on the door, trying to get her attention. "Carol, hey, let me out." There was no answer. Just her voice, softer now, like she was whispering. The light above flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried the handle again, but it was useless. Panic started to set in. That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound, like footsteps on the tile floor, coming closer. I pressed myself against the door, straining to hear click, click, click. Then the whispering stopped. I could feel the presence on the other side of the door, and I wasn't alone. Something wasn't right. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The sound was getting closer, and I could hear faint breathing, deep and uneven. It wasn't Carol anymore. This was something else. Suddenly, the lights in the break room went out, leaving me in total darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, trying to find something, anything, to orient myself. In the pitch black, I could feel a cold draft brush past me, too cold, like it wasn't supposed to be there. A low, guttural voice echoed through the darkness, but it wasn't human. "Let me in." I froze. I knew that voice. It sounded like Carol, but it wasn't her. It was distorted, almost as if someone had mimicked her tone, but with a harsh, rasping quality to it. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. I had to get out of there. I tried the door again, but it was still locked. The voice came again, this time closer, like it was right behind me. "Let me in." I spun around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I darted toward the window. It wasn't locked. I threw it open, the cool air rushing in, but there was no way to climb out. The ground was too far down, and the building was surrounded by a high fence. Desperate, I looked around the room for anything I could use to break the window. That's when I noticed something strange. On the desk in the corner, there was a small framed photo of Carol, but it wasn't a photo I had ever seen before. In the picture, Carol was smiling, but her eyes weren't right. They were wide open, too wide, with no pupils, just black voids. I didn't understand it, but the hairs on my neck stood up as the shadows in the room began to twist and stretch. The air grew thicker, and I could almost feel something moving toward me, something fast. Without thinking, I lunged for the window, knocking the frame off its hinges. The cool night air poured in as I climbed out, breathing heavily. I didn't stop to look back as I ran across the parking lot, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't see Carol the next day. I didn't even hear from her. I called and left messages, but there was no response. The office was eerily quiet when I returned, and when I walked past her desk, I saw her computer still running. But when I looked at the screen, I saw a single, strange image, a distorted photo of me, exactly where I had been standing in the break room, staring at the window. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m., and in the corner of the image was a faint shadow, standing just behind me. I still don't know what happened that night, but I've never stayed late in that office again. It was supposed to be an easy night out of few friends, and I had decided to go stargazing. We found a quiet, isolated hilltop that overlooked the city, far away from the bright lights and noise. The evening had been perfect at first, with the sky an endless sea of stars, a cool breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers, and laughter as we set up our blankets and telescoped out. As the night deepened, the air became colder, more oppressive. We didn't mind at first. We were too busy taking turns peering through the telescope and making silly jokes. But the deeper we went into the night, the more the landscape around us seemed to change. The trees, which had been a comforting ring of shadows, now felt like they were watching us, their branches moving in strange, unnatural ways. The rustling wasn't the wind. It was as if the forest had a life of its own. I shifted on my blanket and glanced at my phone. It was nearly midnight, and I was starting to feel an inexplicable sense of dread. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, one of my friends, Jenna, screamed. We all turned to see her standing by the edge of the hill, her face pale, eyes wide. "What is it?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "There's someone down there," she gasped, pointing into the dark. We all stared in the direction she indicated, but I couldn't see anything, just the inky blackness of the forest below. "Jenna, there's no one there," Matt said, trying to sound reassuring. But there was a tremble in his voice that made my skin crawl. "No, look," she insisted, eyes locked on something in the trees. I squinted, heart thudding in my chest as I tried to see what she saw. It wasn't a person. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long and bendy, like a scarecrow brought to life. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and even from a distance, I could tell it was staring right at us. "Guys, we need to go." "Now," I said, my voice cracking. We gathered our things, but as we started back toward the car, the sound of footsteps came from behind us, uneven and dragging. It felt as though the woods were closing in, surrounding us with the faint, dry rustling of leaves and the thud of heavy feet. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a second figure, this one closer, emerging from the dark. Its eyes were hollow and glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly yellow. My breath caught in my throat as we broke into a run, the air sharp with panic and the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. "Go, go, go," Matt shouted, pushing past me. We all sprinted for the car, the night echoing with the crunch of footsteps behind us. When we finally reached the vehicle, I fumbled to unlock it. Heart racing as the shadows stretched and shifted around us, we piled into the car, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as a figure emerged at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with those hollow eyes. It tilted its head slowly, a broken, jerky motion that made my blood run cold. "Drive, drive," Jenna shouted, and Matt didn't hesitate. The tires screeched against the gravel as we peeled away, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures, their twisted bodies still watching us, still following, until they vanished back into the woods. We didn't stop until we were safely back in town. Every one of us is shaken to speak, but as I lay in bed that night, trying to find sleep, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing, hollow eyes watching us from the dark. The next day, I went back to the hilltop with a friend, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But when we arrived, I found something that made my stomach twist. At the base of the trees were deep, wide tracks, footprints with long, claw-like toes that seemed to stretch into the woods, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the distance, I swore I heard a voice, ragged and whispering, coming from the dark, saying, "You are not supposed to leave."